meeting of the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations is called to order. Good morning. Good morning. This morning we'll have two panels. The first, bon matin, oui. Le premier panel, ce sera de 10 heures.
The first panel will be from 10 to 11:30, and then the second one from 11:30 to 1 p.m.
Charles Burton, Senior Fellow of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who's with us here. Phil Calvert, Senior Fellow of the China Institute at the University of Alberta by video conference, from Toronto. And Paul Evans, Professor, School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia by video conference from Singapore, where it's, I guess, 11 p.m.? So, Mr. Harris, point of order.
Yes, I was looking at the witness list and the number of witnesses in each of the 1.5 hour periods and done some calculations based on our standing orders. And it appears if we are going to have 3 rounds of questioning, we need 64 minutes for that, leaving 26 out of the 90 minutes. So I'm going to suggest that we confine the witnesses to a maximum of 8 minutes each. I've consulted with colleagues on this side. The ones on the other side weren't here yet, but that will allow, otherwise we're going to have a truncation at the end, and Mr. Bergeron and I would not get to participate in the third round.
Should tell you that the clerk advises me that she has advised the witnesses that they have 7 to 10 minutes. Mr. Oliphant?
I'm just going to say that I don't disagree with Mr. Harris. However, I don't think it's fair to our witnesses who have been given time to prepare their statements of 10 minutes. And I would be happy to give up 2 minutes of Liberal time to the third and fourth party if they would need it, because I just don't think it's fair. I don't think that is good parliamentary procedure, and I think it's somewhat rude to our witnesses.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, it's my understanding that all of the witnesses, who I look forward to hearing from, have been told between 7 and 10 minutes. I think also, too, by supplying their briefs in advance, the real value of the experts that we have is to ask them the questions that may or not be illustrated in their briefing. So I would hope that we would just show some flexibility and ask them to either speed up a little bit or slightly edit, knowing that we will actually, the committee will be looking at these briefs in full.
So I think the witnesses undoubtedly heard this conversation, and I hope they'll do their utmost to try to keep it short, but we should get going so we have a chance to have many questions and answers as possible. Mr. Burton. Start with you.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. It's a great honor for me to be invited to give evidence to this committee. I have read all the evidence of the committee's meetings, numbers 3, 4, and 5, that were sent to me by the clerk, and all of this evidence was given by senior Canadian government civil servants explaining to the committee how they implement the Canadian government policy towards China. This morning I'd like to highlight some factors in the Canada-China relationship that I was disappointed to see omitted in the earlier evidence, some assertions that I interpret differently, and finally some recommendations that I have for the Government of Canada on how to more effectively further Canada's interests in our relations with China. Let me say, first of all, that as is the case in many Canadian families, Chinese, not English or French, is the language of my home. I bring this up because in my youth I read a lot of classical Chinese texts in the original, and more than 40 years ago I had the extraordinary privilege of being admitted into the History of Ancient Chinese Thought program in the Department of Philosophy at Fudan University in Shanghai. Because of this, I was taken aback to read in the evidence given to the committee by a senior government official that, and I quote, "The Chinese place an importance on the values of collectivism and harmony owing to a Confucian heritage. Understanding the extent to which China values unity and the needs of society at large rather than freedom of individual choice, we just have to understand that. That's where they're coming from." And later, this earlier witness elaborated, some elements of collectivism and harmony are at odds with individual rights. They're different. Let me point out that this assertion by our ambassador is consistent with the official propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party under General Secretary Xi Jinping. The Chinese Communist Party upholds its political legitimacy by claiming that China's traditional culture demands in this modern age a non-democratic, single-party autocratic rule. I could not disagree more with this interpretation, and I believe it is utterly refuted by the vibrant democracies based on respect for human rights and the rule of law existing today in Taiwan and South Korea. But the troubling question for me, in terms of our policy towards China, is that if Canada accepts this idea that China values unity and the needs of society at large, rather than freedom of individual choice, does that mean, for example, that Canada will stand idly by in the face of the horrendous and massive program of cultural genocide against the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in China, who are confined, as we know, to these so-called re-education camps where they're not permitted to practice their religion at any times over their years of incarceration? Previous witness did not know how many Uyghurs are incarcerated, but I can tell you that the U.S. State Department says 3 million, at least 1 million. Total population of Uyghurs in China is about 10 million. The other thing is, with regard to a response, which we're not making, is that Canada has put the names of officials from Sudan, Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia on our Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Magnitsky list, but in sharp contrast, no Chinese officials complicit in the persecution of Tibetans, Uyghurs, Falun Gong, and Chinese Christians, democracy activists, and so on have been designated. I believe that this sends out a strong signal to the PRC regime by omission, and the signal is that hostage diplomacy and the arbitrary imposition of trade sanctions against Canada is a policy that works. Our lack of any substantive response to this emboldens the Chinese regime to do more of this kind of thing in future. A second point, the evidence given by our civil servants in the previous meetings of this committee repeated over and over the formula that Canada's priority in China relations is, and I quote, the immediate release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, as well as clemency for Robert Schellenberg. But in response to questioning, one of the officials indicated there are two Canadians, Mr. Schellenberg and Mr. Fan Wei, whose charges on the death penalty are public and available. So why is this focus on Kovrig, Spavor, and Schellenberg, three Canadians of non-Chinese origin, to the exclusion of our Canadians, Hussein Jalil and Fan Wei, who are not? I judge that this would be deeply troubling to all Canadians formerly resident in the PRC prior to becoming Canadian citizens and joining our national family. Do we also thereby tacitly accept the Chinese government's claim that persons of Chinese origin in Canada have an obligation of residual loyalty to the Chinese state regardless of their Canadian citizenship? Is this why the serious problem of Chinese state harassment of persons of PRC origin in Canada in gross violation of the protections of the Canadian Charter on Rights and Freedoms is essentially unaddressed by our government? Let me conclude by recommendations that I have for the Government of Canada on how to much more effectively further Canada's interests in China. The PRC's regime's flouting of the standards of international diplomacy is without question becoming more and more blatant as the years go by. Last week, the Czech government's president's office acknowledged the leak of a communication received by that office from the PRC embassy in Prague. In that communication, the PRC threatens that if the Speaker of the Czech Parliament travels to Taiwan as planned, then 3 Czech companies with extensive business in China would be punished, including the famous Petrov Piano Company. So, unlike the PRC sanctions against our canola seeds, the canola seeds being falsely accused of having severe impurities in its dockage, in this Czech case, there is no longer any pretense that there is any legitimate basis for the PRC's threat of trade retaliation if a nation does not comply with the PRC's political agenda. The companies menaced were simply chosen because they have ties to politically influential people in Prague. And the larger question is that Taiwan has a national government utterly in control of its territory, fully legitimated by a liberal democratic election process. Why shouldn't the Czech speaker go there? The Czech speaker has not gone because a few days ago, he tragically died suddenly. Canada has lost the respect of the Chinese regime by our non-action in response to their outrages against us. It's high time for us to kick back by retaliating, especially on China's persistent illegal imports into Canada of the noxious drug fentanyl. What are the consequences for us? We've heard evidence that Canada's external trade with China is about 4.7% of our exports, probably less due to current situations, as compared to 75% to the United States, and that most of our sales to China are primary commodities, canola, soybeans, potash, and so on, wood. In the unlikely event that we did incur the wrath of the Chinese regime by standing for our Canadian principles in maintaining the rules-based international order, and China decided to block us from access to their market further in consequence, the consequences would be highly disruptive to certain sectors that need compensation, but I would suggest not as severe as some people who speak in support of China would make out, because this is a global commodities that are saleable elsewhere. So Canada continuing to do nothing in response to China's violations of the accepted norms of international diplomacy and trade will not, in my view, sustain the status quo in our deteriorating relations in China, and will certainly not allow us to see movement in achieving the release of Jalil, Spavor, and Kovrig. Let me just say one last thing. My friend Anne-Marie Brady spoke to New Zealand's Parliament inquiry on foreign influence earlier this year. She details the Chinese Communist Party's massive scheme of enticing foreign politicians, academics, and business people to promote China's agenda through political lobbying, the media, and academia. Besides offering business opportunities or free trips to China using bribery or honey traps and so on, there are also consultancies in which prominent advisors pocket up to $150,000 US per annum just for being affiliated with PRC entities. So long as the foreign advisor promotes relations with China on PRC terms, the money keeps coming. I urge that we, the committee, look seriously at Australia's 2018 Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act. Canada needs to come to terms with Chinese money benefiting Canadian political campaigns and rewarding Canadian politicians and public servants who are seen as friends of China. Mr. Chair, I welcome vigorous and challenging questions from members of the committee on any of this and any other topics. There are many topics that I've been unable to address in this short statement. I do regret that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before I start, I want to apologize for my informal appearance. I'm actually just transiting Toronto on the way to go trekking in Turkey, so I'm kind of stopping in to do this.
Just to wait 2 seconds while we get the speakers operating correctly here.
Speakers aren't operating?
Well, I think we should, and the earpieces only? Yeah. Where did the clerk go?
I think she's gone to the back to sort things out.
Okay. Okay, please proceed. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to apologize for my informal appearance because I'm transiting Toronto en route to Turkey for a trekking holiday. So, and my statement is just about 8 minutes, so I hope I'll go through it as quickly as I can. Thank you for inviting me to appear before this committee. It's an honor to have the opportunity to discuss the Canada-China relationship, something that occupied a sizable portion of my career in Canada's Foreign Service. I've had the privilege of observing and participating in the Canada-China relationship for over more than 30 years. This included 3 postings to our embassy in Beijing between 1984 and 2008, as well as serving as deputy negotiator for Canada during China's accession to the World Trade Organization, and later on as Director General for North Asia and what is now Global Affairs Canada. These assignments were both fascinating and difficult because managing Canada-China relations, even at the best of times, is challenging. China is complex and full of contradictions. Its diplomatic face can be smooth and sophisticated or ham-handed and brutish. And as Canada has now witnessed firsthand, its reward and punishment approach to relations with all but the most powerful of countries means that relations can turn on a dime and suddenly enter a deep freeze. That's what Canada is experiencing now, with the arrest of the 2 Michaels in retaliation for Canada's detention of Meng Wanzhou, bilateral relations have plunged to their lowest point since Canada and China established diplomatic relations 50 years ago. The Meng Wanzhou case presents some very difficult choices for the government. There is no perfect solution. It can let the case work its way through the court system, and if the judge rules that the extradition should proceed, this will lead to a trial and possibly many years of detention and imprisonment under very difficult circumstances for the two Canadians. If the Minister of Justice decides to intervene in the case and release Meng in order to obtain the release of the two Michaels, it rewards China's bad behavior. And let's not forget that they are not the first Canadians to have been arbitrarily arrested in response to actions by the Canadian government. For this reason, it is imperative that such a decision be part of a broader comprehensive strategy for managing our relationship with China. China sees this issue, I believe, in geopolitical terms, and Meng's arrest as part of a larger US-led strategy to hinder China's rise and to undermine China's leading companies. They will not back down. For this reason, I believe that the only way to obtain the release of the two Michaels is through the release of Meng Wanzhou, either as a result of a judicial decision or action by the Minister of Justice, and other outstanding issues. But I also think Canada could play a leading role in crafting a collective response to China's practice of taking hostages. China has been engaged in this practice with virtual impunity for some time and has arbitrarily imprisoned citizens of a number of countries. If all countries affected by this practice could commit to a common and collective response, trade measures, for example, when a citizen of one of the countries is taken hostage, it would send a strong message to China that such actions will not be tolerated. It's a complex and tough situation, and charting a way forward will be difficult. And there's been talk, particularly from China's side, about getting through this current situation and putting the relationship back on track, which is implied as being returning to the way things were before Meng's arrest. I don't think we can go back to the way things were before. This case has done significant harm to China's image in Canada. It has led to a fundamental shift in Canadian attitudes and in the relationship itself. China is and will continue to be important to Canada, both as an economic power and a global player, but the current situation has underscored the importance of approaching China with a critical eye and an understanding of what drives its foreign policy decisions. China's approach to foreign affairs is tough, strategic, and driven by power rather than principle. It is almost exclusively focused on advancing its own interests through the exercise of hard and soft power, including in global institutions. Its perspective is informed by its history of being carved up and invaded by foreign powers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because of this, China is determined never to be weak again and is focused upon returning to its earlier prominence as a global power. Within the Chinese system, there is a strong undercurrent of skepticism and suspicion of the West's intentions and ultimate agenda with respect to China. We should also keep in mind that a fundamental driver of Chinese foreign policy, indeed all policy, is keeping the Communist Party in power. The leadership is thus focused on stability, which requires sustained economic growth, peaceful relations at its borders, and increasingly addressing middle-class concerns about environmental degradation and corruption. Securing and maintaining this stability is also part of Xi Jinping's drive for a stronger global presence and leadership role for his country. Successful management of relations with China requires a clear sense of Canada's priorities and interests and a tough-minded commitment to advancing and defending them. Stories of early Canadian missionaries in China, of Norman Bethune, and Canada's decision to sell wheat to China in the wake of the Great Famine all provide good imagery and heartwarming content for speeches, but are largely irrelevant. China deals in power and respects power. A firm and strategic pushback in defense of Canada's interests, knowing where our leverage lies, will garner respect. Being too accommodating and out of concerns for friendship or fear of offending will make us seem weak. China plays this game well. It is also important for a government to avoid the tendency to view China through a preconceived ideological or political lens, or through a single issue. Doing so undermines our capacity to deal with the complex reality of the country and our relationship with it. The past 2 decades have seen wide swings in how successive governments have initially approached China. An overarching long-range vision supported by all parties would put Canada in a more advantageous position to consistently manage our relations with this country. Moving forward, Canada needs a balanced approach based on a realistic understanding of China as it is, the opportunities and the challenges. This approach should also inform Canada's approach to Asia as a whole and our view of China's place in our approach to the region. With its strong focus on China over the last decades, Canada may have overlooked opportunities to form deeper ties with other countries whose markets are easier to navigate and whose systems, in Japan, for example, are based on the rule of law. The CPTPP should help in this rebalancing and diversification of Canada's trade interests in Asia. Canada's public support for broadening the agreement to include Thailand and Taiwan would further help this diversification. Canada should also give a consideration to its relationship with Taiwan, a vibrant and progressive democracy, and the only Asian country to approve same-sex marriage. Canada and Taiwan have a healthy trading relationship with good potential for the future. Prime Minister Trudeau's public statement in support of Taiwan's meaningful participation in organizations like ICAO and the World Health Assembly is a good signal, but there is more that Canada could do to advance our interests there. A visit by a Canadian economic minister to support Canadian commercial objectives would respect the parameters of the One China policy and would send an important signal to both China and Taiwan. Successful management of Canada-China ties requires coordination and coherence. Many federal government departments and most provinces have interests in the country. Although provinces sometimes compete for investment in students, they should be encouraged to buy into Canada's broader agenda in China. On core and important issues like human rights and the two Michaels, the Canadian governments at all levels should present a united and consistent front in their discussions with their Chinese counterparts. Canada-China relations are in a difficult place right now, and there is no easy path forward. But this is also an opportunity to objectively assess the relationship and to develop a realistic and balanced approach to our ties with this important global power. I wish you all the best in these important deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Calvert. And now, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity to appear before the committee, albeit virtually by video conference, 15,000 kilometers away in Singapore. I've been studying and teaching international relations for more than 40 years, mostly dealing with U.S.-China and Canada-China relations. The focus of my remarks today will be about government-to-government relations between Canada and China. The overall relationship is, of course, much broader and includes human flows, cultural, business, and educational exchanges. But this is an era in which high politics matter and government policies are in flux. All of us are aware how the fates of Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor, and Meng Wanzhou have generated a major diplomatic rift and changed the emotional landscape of feelings and emotions in both countries. Trust and mutual respect have been badly shaken. More recently, the COVID-19 virus has affected Canadian interactions with China and our views about how to evaluate the competence of the government of the People's Republic. In the midst of these and other controversies, it's tempting to think that when they're resolved, we can revert to normal in our bilateral diplomatic relations. I think this is unlikely. Rather, we have entered new territory, the product of forces much larger than individual incidents and consular cases, and much larger than commercial issues like Huawei's potential involvement in our 5G telecommunications network. We are living amidst major shifts in economic, diplomatic, and technological power, the emergence of a multipolar world order, and a resurgence of great power rivalry. For almost all of the past 50 years, there has been a consensus in Canada about the main outlines of a China policy, one we came to call engagement, and that at one time involved a strategic partnership between our two countries. Engagement was built on three pillars. The closer interaction with China was of commercial value and would benefit the prosperity of Canadians. Second, that it was initially important to end China's isolation and later to integrate it into what we now call our rules-based international order. And third, that it served the moral purpose of supporting economic and societal openness that would lead over time to political liberalization in China. Engagement Canadian style depended on a geopolitical context in which Canada had room for independent maneuver when it moved in somewhat different directions than Washington. For example, in recognizing the PRC 8 years ahead of the US. Engagement with Canadian characteristics overall was very successful, but it now has to be rethought not out of anger about specific Chinese actions or fear about the hard edge of growing Chinese power and influence. It needs to be amended because of new circumstances that are not likely to change anytime soon. The geopolitical and geoeconomic balances are shifting. China is now a major global player, present in virtually every international institution and proving capable of creating some of its own. Moreover, it is increasingly assertive in pursuing its own interests and in challenging the liberal dimensions of those institutions, particularly as they relate to human rights and democracy. China doesn't need Canadian help in the way it did in past, and in some instances is championing positions that challenge us directly. The belief that economic openness would produce political liberalization now seems mistaken, at least for the time being. Under Xi Jinping, China is more repressive domestically and along its periphery than at any time since Mao Zedong. In addition, a new American consensus has emerged, spearheaded by the Trump administration, but with broader bipartisan support, that the American version of engagement is dead. It has been replaced by a framing of China somewhere along a continuum of strategic competitor, adversary, rival, or enemy. Washington is engaged in a full-court press, militarily, diplomatically, and economically, to counter China's rising influence and power. As Henry Kissinger recently stated, this has led the U.S. and China to the foothills of a Cold War. As Washington is making abundantly clear in its pressure on Canada and other governments on the matter of Huawei and 5G, the costs of a made-in-Canada choice could be steep. Caught between Xi Jinping's China dream and Donald Trump's America First, and a deepening geostrategic competition between the two, what can Canada do? Let me make 3 recommendations. First, rather than signing up for Cold War 2.0 and the active containment or confinement of China, we need to discuss and define a more flexible policy frame. Engaging China 2.0, a sort of post-engagement engagement policy, is one way. Another would be coexisting with China. Neither is premised on changing China, but on finding ways to live with China. Neither locks China into defined roles as friend or adversary, partner or competitor, ally or existential threat, but allows Canadian interests and values to determine the course of action on an issue-by-issue basis. Cooperate where we can in areas including climate change, global economic and financial governance, peacekeeping, agri-tech, and the Arctic, to name a few. Push back where we must, particularly in matters related to interference in our domestic affairs and gross violations of human rights. Second, we need to fight for the rule-based international order at the same time we promote its reform in institutions including the WTO, IMF, and World Bank, and through regional processes like the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. We need to push back against efforts to unravel or corrode the multilateral rules-based system, whether those challenges come from China or, as we have increasingly seen, from the United States. This will require recapturing a middle power identity that respects our alliance with the U.S., but navigates an independent course in matters like supporting the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or giving a balanced assessment of its Belt and Road Initiative, both of which offer new approaches to international cooperation and development. We will not be with the U.S. or with China in all matters, but we will not be alone. it is worth looking closely at how other countries facing similar dilemmas are adjusting their China policies. A good start would be Australia, Japan, Singapore, and perhaps the United Kingdom. Finally, a new frontier of the relationship is reacting to China's growing presence, influence, and occasional interference in Canada. A higher level of awareness and vigilance is needed to protect Canadian values and institutions at home. We need to do this without sensationalizing or exaggerating Chinese activities and their impact, without singularizing China as the only player in the influence and interference business, and without stigmatizing Chinese Canadians by calling into question their integrity and loyalty. How, for example, do we keep doors open to Chinese students and to research exchanges in our universities while closing windows to protect intellectual property and national security in an era of technological competition with China and extraterritorial pressure from the United States? Fashioning a new national consensus and a new narrative for relations with China and building it on a multi-party foundation are not going to be easy. We haven't tried it in a systematic way since 1966. The work and recommendations of this special committee have the potential to make a signal contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to our first round of questions, 6-minute round. Mr. Albus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for bringing your expertise today. I think I'm going to start first with Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans, Graham Allison's book entitled Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Through Cities Trap, deals with major shifts in global power, and obviously it explores the oft-cited observation from the history of the Peloponnesian War, which deals with events from the 5th century BCE, namely that it was the rise of Athens and fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. Now, according to Mr. Allison, tensions inside, when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, the resulting structural stress makes for a violent clash the rule, not the exception. I'd like you just to start with asking you, is the world facing a Thucydides trap with the rise of China?
We had the opportunity to bring Professor Allison up to Ottawa 2 months ago to talk about his book, because I think you're quite accurate that it has grabbed the imagination of people who see a power shift underway and see the potentialities for major U.S.-China confrontation. I think that what Professor Allison is trying to tell us is that unless special efforts are made to reduce tensions between the United States and China, to find new ways to manage relations, that that conflict, not just a Cold War, but something worse, is possible. And I think that where Mr. Allison and a number of Americans are now looking is how to frame that relationship, not as China as adversary or as enemy, but something of a competitor and a partner at the same time, what Mr. Allison calls a partnership rivalry. And his message to us in Canada was that we could be supportive of that in a variety of activities and international organizations. So yes, that is the fear that we wake up with every day. And if action isn't taken to mitigate that conflict, that destined for war is a very strong possibility.
Mr. Burton, would you like to rein in on the subject?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I am very concerned about the rise of China, and particularly, such phenomena as we see as PRC citizens in key roles in multilateral organizations that seem to be seeking to undermine the purposes of those organizations, presumably under instruction from Beijing. I mean, Interpol and ICAO and other UN institutions, and in general, the Chinese state's penetration into Canada, we don't have sufficient adequate laws comparable to other nations about the transfer of classified technologies to agents of Chinese state. You may have noticed the total number of Canadian cases on this matter over the past few years, to the best of my knowledge, is 0, whereas other countries are able to bring these people to account. Or the case of the Public Security Bureau of China agents coming to Canada under false pretenses to pressure persons in our country. You know, our RCMP's response is that if we discover that someone has come into Canada under false pretenses, under those circumstances, that they are immediately deported back to China. No accountability to the person involved. And so I am concerned in general about the threat that China's desire to undermine the established institutions of the global order, the WTO and the United Nations, and replace them with what Party General Secretary Xi Jinping in October 2017 defined as the community of the common destiny of mankind, which is really a reorientation of the global order in the context of his belief that the United States will decline towards China, including the Belt and Road Initiative that will reorient global infrastructure towards Beijing. So I believe that it's important that we recognize what's going on, and with our allies, particularly the United States, where there is, I think, nonpartisan political consensus about this issue, not just Mr. Trump, but, you know, his nemesis, Speaker Pelosi has also articulated it, that we need to be standing up for the principles of the rules-based order, which protect middle powers like Canada from the arbitrary domination of hegemonic superpowers. And I'm particularly concerned about China because of the values gap that informs that regime that's so different from what makes Canada a great nation.
Right now that describes the United States' approach as unilateral universalism, and the Chinese approach as universal unilateralism. So very different approaches indeed, and I'm sorry to Mr. Calvert, I don't believe we have enough time to ask you to fill in on that, but I will be hopefully raising some more questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Frederick-Skatos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your very thoughtful perspectives and recommendations. This is a question that I want to put to everyone, to all witnesses, but perhaps I'll begin with Mr. Calvert, based on your career as a diplomat, sir. When we think about the disputes and challenges that other liberal democracies have faced in recent times with Beijing, what has worked and what has not worked in terms of overcoming those challenges for the liberal democracy, whatever liberal democracy might be? And I emphasize liberal democracy because I think it's important to compare apples to apples. Canada's a liberal democracy, and I'd love to hear any thoughts that the three of you have on that particular issue, because it would be quite useful for this committee to hear that.
Well, I believe one of the things that has worked for some liberal democracies is size and power. And I believe one of the ways that the countries with more political or economic clout naturally have more ability to respond to China and China's assertiveness in their own interests. I think for Canada, what works is more collective action. What works is assembling like-minded and gathering together to jointly present concerns or common worries that they have, and in reaction to specific actions that Canada has taken. And we found this over the years. Canada alone sometimes doesn't have the leverage by itself to influence China, but if you can collectively put other nations on side, that sends a stronger message.
I'm sorry to cut you off, sir. It's just a limit of time,
Sure.
That's all. If I could go to Professor Calvert, any concrete examples of how liberal democracies have been able to overcome challenges with China in terms of specific approaches that they've taken? Strategies, tactics? Professor Evans, excuse me.
You know, I think that liberal democracies have been able on some matters to put a focal point on difficulties. It's fascinating to see which have organized to raise some of the special problems of Xinjiang. But I think that in addressing the challenge of China, the countries we need to work with are more diverse than just liberal democracies. The balance of forces is shifting in such a way that other kinds of countries are trying to have an influence on China in not trying to fundamentally change China's political values and system, but some of their behavior. We look at the countries of Southeast Asia that are deeply concerned about Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, and the kinds of activities around that are multilateral, but are not premised on us as Western countries pushing an outcome with China, but a collection that is broader. That's going to be the kind of some of the actions that are going to be necessary to constrain certain Chinese actions, recognizing that almost every country wants to work with China more closely bilaterally and in its interests economically, but also encouraging Chinese behavior in a proper direction. So to me, it's bigger than a liberal democracy challenge, even though there's special elements of that for us.
Thank you. Mr. Burton?
Well, I think that we should be looking more closely at Australia as a country that has taken certain measures to try and limit Chinese influence through legislation. Certainly in terms of our own attempt to rally our allies, I believe that this unfortunately has probably had the opposite effect to what's intended, in the sense that we, can list 14 countries that support us, claiming that there are other countries that support us in their hearts but are afraid to say anything. And I think the Chinese government would compare 14 against the total number of countries in the world and see that they retain support for their horrendous behavior with regard to Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Svaver, who I think, like Kevin Garrett before them, the Chinese have been unable to provide us with any evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever in their case. So I do think that it would be a wonderful thing if Canada would take the lead in trying to come up with some multilateral, coalition of the like-minded to try and put some transparency and honesty in our relations with China. Presently, I think there's a psychology in Canada that the most important thing in our relations with China is the promotion of Canadian prosperity through enhanced trade. But, the cost that China wants to extract from us for that in pursuit of their overall agenda, such as removing restrictions on Canadian exports of high-tech to China, or allowing unfettered Chinese state access to Canadian mining and oil, or insisting that we install the Huawei 5G into our telecommunications, and so on. These things are not worth the cost to Canada in the long run. While we may, or some companies, perhaps politically connected companies, may achieve profits from collaboration with the Chinese regime, we're better off standing up for our laws and values. And if China wants to punish us because of that, then I believe that we have to accept the consequences and the interests, overall longer interests of Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Branchkatis. Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur le Président, vous me
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would begin by thanking our witnesses for their presentations, which were very enlightening to us. Mr. Burton was deploring the fact that he would have liked to have bring up further issues. So I would invite our witnesses not to hesitate to send us any further materials containing their observations, points of view, perspectives on any issues on this topic. I believe their contributions can be of great use to our committee. Now, I'd like to summarize everything we've heard from our three witnesses, and in fact, 4 main points emerge. The mythical era of relations between Canada and China based on friendship, collaboration, missionary work in the past, Norman Bethune, Canadian wheat sales to China, the recognition by Canada of the Chinese Popular Republic before the U.S. did so, all of that is over. We're in a new era. Second, China is a growing power, and China believes that power in and of itself is a value, and China aspires to be powerful. Third, Canada should stand up in the face of China. And lastly, we should try to develop a multilateral response to the actions taken by China, which go against international rules, actions which do not respect any of these international rules by Chinese authority. This 4-point summary, do the witnesses believe that it's a good overview of what was said this morning? So any of the witnesses may respond.
You're probably all interested in answering that. Just to be sure of that, would you like to raise your hands if you're interested in answering that? I see Mr. Burton first, so.
Absolument, Monsieur Bergeron. Absolument.
Absolutely, Mr. Bergeron. Yes.
If members of the Parti Québécois are in these committees, and I thank you for that. I also have taken on your suggestion that more materials could be sent to the committee, and I will be honored to provide those things. I agree with you in all these points that you raised, which are summarizing basically what I've said. I do think that it's important that Canada not try and do this alone with China. If we can come up with some consensus, that would be wonderful. I think the countries that I find have the best knowledge of communism, including the Russians and the Chinese, are countries in Eastern Europe, such as the Czech Republic, Poland, Lithuania, and so on. These countries understand how these kind of hegemonic powers work, and I would encourage us to draw broadly on the countries that we seek to ally with to try and come up with some way to preserve what's good in our Canadian values and the way that we engage in foreign policy. Thank you.
Mr. Evans?
Mr. Bergeron's question is, in summary, is intriguing in several ways, and each of the points I think are going to need to be fleshed in more fully as the committee proceeds with its discussions. I would raise just a possible addition to the fourth point that he raised, and it's about China as an international actor. I think we have to be realistic that there are certain things that China does that we don't like. There are certain kinds of policies that it pursues that anger its neighbors and others. But overall, China's involvement in the international system, I would suggest, is in fact stabilizing rather than destabilizing. On balance, in most of the international institutions it operates in most of the ones that it has created, but also the Western organizations that have been put in place, China responds and plays a responsible game. It has benefited from the global order that we all put together and with the United States leadership. In several areas, it is trying to be the anchor to that order rather than the destabilizer. Some of the other witnesses will talk about this in more detail, but I think we can't frame China exclusively as an outlier or as a threat. On the main, it has been a responsible international citizen. Now, is that changing? Will it change in future? We're all worried. But at the moment, we have to put it into that perspective.
Mr. Calvert, I didn't see your hand up, so I'll go back to...
Yes,
yes, you did.
sorry.
I'm sorry. Pardon me.
I did raise it. Sorry. I just wanted to follow up a bit with something I think I said perhaps not very clearly in my opening statement, which is that any attempt to define China very simply, to label China as this kind of actor or that kind of actor, misses a much more complex story about how they perform internationally. And that's not just limited to China, but it is particularly evident in China. In some organizations, as Professor Evans has said, they're stabilizing influence. In other organizations or other activities they make, we find it less than helpful. Their actions less than helpful. I think it has to go back to what China itself sees as how it will benefit. If it will benefit from stability in an organization, if it will benefit from assuming geopolitically, from assuming a leadership role in an organization, and especially organizations from which the United States has retreated, then it serves its own interests. So one of the things I've learned about China is that there are no simple answers to any questions you ask about it. And this is another one of those questions.
Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your very informative comments. Professor Evans, when your comments about the international order and China's place in it reflect to some extent the United Kingdom House of Commons report of last April, in which they say that China's foreign policy goals primarily are designed to protect their domestic political system, which I think we've heard from Mr. Burton as well. But they underscore that by saying that they more to do with, and even they don't want to change the international world order as such, but they're more interested in ensuring that their own domestic policies are not challenged. And they say that the Chinese domestic politics cannot be treated as if they were separate from foreign policy, and the UK must adjust its approach to China accordingly. Now, what that means in practice, I think they say later on in the report, which I will ask another question on afterwards, but given that, do you agree with that assessment that this is, they're not out to change the world in its own image, but rather to make sure that their system is prevailing, and that perhaps that's a key to understanding what they do internationally?
Well, China isn't alone as a great power trying to protect its own international interests and its own value structure in its own country, its own sovereignty. China, in that sense, is acting in many ways like great powers that we've known in past and probably in future. But I think that the idea that China has an absolutely clear conception of what it wants a world order to look like, that's a little misleading. I think that there are different strands that we see in Chinese behavior and attitudes that suggest they have not got a single vision of what they want. They do have certain immediate interests. They want to defend them. They want to protect them. They also want to keep globalization alive and moving forward. They benefited from it, and on balance, it's in their interest. But the challenge with China is that in 80% of activities, it's a responsible actor. There are things they want to change, and those are mainly around issues related to human rights, democracy promotion, which they feel are antithetical to their interests. So yes, China as a defender of a world order, an international order, but China not as a defender of a liberal international order. And something that is very difficult for many of us is that many, many countries are supportive of China's general approach in this. The balance away from the liberal democracies and the world order as we understood it is happening, and in part because the United States is stepping away from it as well. So these are turbulent times for everyone.
We'll have a lot of questions, frankly, but the one I would ask all of you to comment on, and again, going back to the UK House of Commons, which studied this recently, in the end, and we've talked about the different aspects of policy, Mr. Burton's views being starkly different from some of the others, but at the end, they urged the UK government to produce a single, detailed, public document defining the UK's China strategy. Now, is that something that is realistic to expect a government like Canada to do? And in these circumstances, how do we reconcile the suggestion by Mr. Burton that we should take a very hard line, risk any trade with China, and on the other hand, seek to engage China in working with the issues of climate change and others that we have a collective interest in?
You to indicate what you'd like to, because we only have less than 2 minutes.
I think
Sorry,
Mr. Burton, perhaps you could answer
Thank you.
first.
Yeah, I mean, everyone talks about how this is complex or complicated, but the fact is that General Secretary Xi Jinping's plan is clear. It's what's referred to as the 200s plan, achievement of elimination of poverty by the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party, which was in 1921, so next year. Achieving a middle-class society by 2035, and then by the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, which would be 2049, but actually they use 2050, that China will become the dominant power on the planet, that the Belt and Road will be achieved, that the institutions will be adopting this community of the common destiny of mankind. So I think that that's clear. In terms of your other one, do I like the idea that we should be absolutely honest and open and frank and transparent about how we plan to engage in our foreign policy towards the People's Republic of China? Yes, I do believe that it's better to not be, having secret, unknown plans, and I think we should lay it out on the line. We stand for liberal democracy. Paul has said that that the new world order will not be a liberal world order. I don't want to live in a world that's not a liberal world order.
Is there
15 seconds.
15 seconds. You want to say yay or nay from Singapore? Could you tell us whether you think that's a good idea of having a defined policy?
Many of us have claimed for a long time that we need a China policy. I think what this committee and your committee can do is help us set out what the basic theme or melody might be in that relationship. I suggested engagement 2.0 or coexisting with China. The Americans and some other countries have set out recent approaches. The Americans is this adversarial one, Australians more nuanced. But we're at a moment where clarity is needed, but is going to be extremely difficult to construct. And that's why we have such wonderful representatives in Ottawa as our members of Parliament.
Oh, aren't you nice? And yes, you're buttering us up. On to the second round, 5 minutes each. Mr. Williamson.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. I'm going to build a little bit off some of the remarks that Mr. Bergeron made. What struck me from the testimony is, with some slight degree, everyone seemed to agree that we can't go back. There's no going back to a normal relationship with China. As a result, I think, of what has taken place over the last number of years and months, and as well because of a changing and a different China as well. And someone mentioned this, and I'll come back to this. It seems we made a bet over the last generation that we would work to end China's isolation, first grant the country most favored nation status as a way to bring it into the international order, and then after that into the World Trade Organization. I think as well, I read at one point that even Margaret Thatcher's gamble on Hong Kong was to hand the territory back to mainland China in the hopes that it would spark a more liberal approach to its politics, which of course, unfortunately, has not happened. We are a liberal democracy. China is not, and if anything, it is reverting further away from us. So if what we're seeing is not working, and if the bet is not paid off, it would seem to me that the position of what struck me is that your comments were almost they run counter to what I hear from official Ottawa, from Government of Canada policy, both from the ambassador as well as ranking government officials as well. Is that correct? If you could maybe, I'll limit your comments to a minute, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Burton, why don't you start since you're right here?
Yes, I agree. I don't think that our current policy is sufficiently aware of the necessity for Canada to try and stand up for our own values in our engagement with China and the overall interest of the future of the world. So I think from that point of view, certainly the question really is, why is it that so many key policymakers seem to be reluctant to engage with China in an honest and forceful way? Are some of these people, in fact, under, to some extent, the influence of Canadian business with interests in China, or for other reasons, adopt positions which mean that they're supporting a policy of engaging with China on Chinese PRC terms?
Mr. Calvert also put his hand up. Professor
Yeah, look, with respect to previous policies of help supporting China's international growth in acceding to organizations like the WTO, maybe some politicians thought that China joining the WTO would bring about liberal democracy. Negotiators didn't. I think what we hoped from this was perhaps a somewhat better system of commercial law. And China's accession to the WTO has benefited both sides. It's benefited people and companies in the sense of reduced tariffs. And while we're not happy with completely how China implements or doesn't implement some of its obligations, it has substantially changed the China's trading system. If you compare it to the way it was in 2000, compare it to the way it was afterwards, in a positive way. I wouldn't agree with your statement. I don't think it's about when we say we can't go back to the kind of way it was before. It doesn't mean we don't want to engage China in some new way, that we need to work with China and its presence in the international community. Yes, we have to be firm, but we have to be intelligent about how we engage China and choose where our interests lie and where we can work with China internationally and where we collide with our interests. We also have to, in the case of human rights, look to, if we're going to articulate human rights concerns, lecturing is not effective. Sometimes it's necessary. But anyway, my time is up. We should also be giving a business case for it.
So let me. I'm curious then. So fair enough. Would you agree then that a continuing of ratcheting up, or the path we're on, is not necessarily is not the way to go? So, for example, we have worked to bring China into the international, I'll call it economic order, WTO. There are now called, the next step, of course, would be a free trade agreement with China, which would, of course, deepen those ties. Do you think that is the next step, or should we be very wary of entering into a free trade agreement with a country that is known to steal technology and is frankly not a market-oriented player in its outlook of economics the way Canada and other Western countries are?
I believe now we should be very careful about entering a free trade agreement with China. I think what has been demonstrated by China, especially in the last year with us, is that the rule of law continues to be a challenge. And if you want to have a free trade agreement with a country, you have to have some confidence that it's going to implement its obligations bilaterally with you, that is made with you bilaterally. So I don't think this is the time, and frankly, I don't think there's a political will to do so anyway on the Canadian side.
My question is directed to Professor Evans.
John,
thank you for staying up so
you've
late
got an improper bonus of a minute
to participate. Could you, in your statement, you mentioned 3 strategies or recommendations that Canada could consider. Could you elaborate what you meant by flexible policy framework?
You know, this has to do with the matter of how we define China as from a spectrum, from a friend to a partner, to a rival, to an adversary, to an enemy. Where on that spectrum do we do it? And I'm suggesting that it depends on the issue that we're dealing with China. and that it is no one hat fits all wearers. So that as we move forward with China, we have to see we have a variety of interests. Commercial, in the international agenda we're pushing, the development objectives we would like to see in the world. China is multiple things at the same time. This is not a problem when we think about the United States. When we think about the United States, particularly in this era, we're looking at a country that is pulling in several different directions at the same time. So just as with the United States, we now increasingly look on an issue-to-issue basis rather than one single formula, that flexibility that is going to come by engagement in the broadest sense of the word, rather than in the way we pursued it in past, I think that's the track we're going to have to go forward on because of the new power dynamics in play.
Could you comment further on how we can work together with China in peacekeeping, the Arctic, and the environment?
Well, I think each of those need special attention. But I would raise one in particular, which is peacekeeping. And it's a perfect example of the choices we make. For some, working with China on peacekeeping is cooperating with a future enemy. Their activities, China is now the largest player in international peacekeeping of the P5 countries. I take a different view. I think that on peacekeeping, Canadian experience and Chinese capabilities, there are several areas where we can cooperate and where the world urgently needs an enhanced peacekeeping capability. So to use that as an example, these are the case studies, some of which your committee might be willing to take on, where we do have some commonality of interest, recognizing there's some risks we have to take account of during that process. And we could give an itemized list, if you wish, of we've been working on a dozen or 15 different areas where we think there are special chances for cooperation that benefit both of us, but also the world order we'd like to see.
Be helpful if you could send that. Why do you think that they have the largest peacekeeping force, or that they are represented so strongly around the world? Does it have anything to do with the Belt and Road Initiative?
I think that China's use of its military is complicated. It is increasingly having its forces based in other countries. Only a small number. The United States has over 400 foreign military bases. China has, depends how you count it, 2 or 3 or 4. So there are mixed motives in what China is doing. But the argument is that because they have the resources, they have the troops that they're willing to put in, and a marvelous training system that has been internationally supported, that we can try to accentuate the positive with them. And with eyes open, as I say, for other motives as well that we have to try to discourage in the longer term.
Thank you. 30 seconds. I don't know if this can be answered in 30 seconds, but it's directed to all the panelists. China has conveyed its appreciation to the government's response regarding the coronavirus emergency. So how likely is it that this will contribute to a thaw in the Canada-China relations? Is there
time for 1 minute, 1 word answer from each member? You want to say very, not at all? Mr. Burton?
Definitely a good thing.
Mr. Calvert? Mr. Evans?
We missed that. Couldn't
Sorry, I
hear.
didn't hear.
Minimal.
Okay. Professor Evans?
I think the coronavirus can be a significant plus or a significant negative in our relationship with China.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Alislev, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I think this has been incredible in moving the discussion. What I've heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that overall our current approach is not serving us in the best interest possible, that there is a sense of urgency to address that lack of or weakness in our current approach, and that some of the suggestions are around the benefit that Canada has as a middle power in being able to rely on other like-minded countries, either in the region or in the broader Western, or simply within our own country, having a single voice and finding a way to reestablish the strength of the international institutions to be able to protect and preserve middle powers in a world where we're seeing the rise of great powers. What I would like to hear from all of you, from your perspective, what specific actions can we take to engage and strengthen those collective, coordinated approaches with other like-minded countries who find themselves also in similar situations, and even within our own country? Mr. Burton?
Well, I do think that it would be great if Canada took the initiative, as we've taken most recently with the conference on North Korea, the landmines. You know, Canada has a history of coordinating with like-minded powers to achieve goods for the global community. I think that we also need to strengthen our capacity to engage with the Chinese regime. You know, under Ambassador Gottlieb, we changed the way we engaged in Washington from beyond the State Department into Congress, into local legislatures, and all the areas of power in the United States. In China, we're falling very far behind in our capacity to actually engage with the people who count and who are involved in the policy-making process that is affecting us so badly inside China. So, you know, I would certainly encourage that. I think the other thing is that we keep talking about China, but we're really talking about the current government of China under Xi Jinping. I think that will not last forever. You know, we shouldn't be feeling that there's a destiny here of the end of liberal democracy in global affairs, that we could be engaging agents of change within China and supporting people that we identify in China as doing good. We've done this before with human rights dialogues and civil society program and senior judges training. On my 2 postings as a diplomat in China, I was very much involved in those. All of those initiatives failed, but I don't think we ought to give up on the idea of democracy in China.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Evans.
I think we're facing a double challenge, a China challenge and an America challenge. And building or rebuilding an international order, we're going to have to work with both of those countries as best we can. I think that, for example, getting them into some of the new multilateral trade organizations, like if it won't work globally, the Trans-Pacific Partnership should have accession clauses where we could imagine both China and the United States, when they are willing and able, to come into them. I would say, secondly, that where we can try to work together as middle powers is with special reference to here in Southeast Asia through the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The idea of...
Thank you. I want to make sure that I give Mr. Calvert an opportunity too, considering that was a very significant emphasis of your opening remarks. What action can we take, Mr. Calvert?
We can, first of all, we have specific issues. This has to be an issue-by-issue sort of decision, focusing on choosing, for example, with respect to the 2 Michaels. There are a number of countries, as I mentioned, who have had hostages taken. Collectively, they can get together and say, okay, in the next time a citizen is taken from one of our countries, we will have a common response to this. We can pull people together who have common interests in other areas as well. I think that's what our diplomats do. I also think that, building on what Professor Burton has says, we have a lot of trade commissioners in China, but we don't have an adequate representation of of trade of officers in our embassies who do political and advocacy work. There's a lot more that could be put, more resources that could be put in that direction, because making more connections with the party system, making more connections with local governments and everything is something where we can find ways to advance our interests and try to influence the government. I want to make one more thing.
I'm sorry, we haven't got time for any more. We're over time a bit there. Ms.
Thank you very
Van.
much.
Thank you very much, and good day, gentlemen, whatever time zone you happen to be in. I have three questions, one for each of you. So if you keep that in mind, I'm going to start with Mr. Burton. Mr. Burton, what do you think would be the concrete consequences of a very tough policy response to Chinese behaviors that we disagree with on Canada-China relations going forward?
I'm fairly confident that because the relationship between Canada and China is so asymmetrical in favor of China, that we would not get this negative response. I think we would gain respect from China, and that they would be, they would expect us to not simply be passive in response to the successive outrages that they have committed against the rules-based global order in diplomacy and trade. I really think, for example, that we should crack down on the activities of agents of the Chinese state in Canada, on money laundering in BC, which affects the, some people connected to the senior leadership of the regime. That's why I think they protect Ms. Meng so carefully. And other actions such as inspecting shipments from China strictly to stop this fentanyl scourge from coming into our country. I think there are a lot of things we could do. I don't think that, frankly, I mean, I understand that we can't predict that regime, and they don't seem to behave in a way which, is fair or reciprocal, as one would expect in global relations. But I'm not that worried that if we show some backbone, that we will suffer disastrous consequences for our economy and relations. But continuing story.
Thank you very much. For Mr. Calvert, what have you learned as a diplomat or professor about the best way to engage China even when we have disagreements with them?
I would say two things. One is tone is important, as it is with any kind of relationship, and that public, while public statements are sometimes useful, they are also blunt instruments, and they have to be matched with other kinds of engagement that takes place out of the public eye. Secondly, I would say that the more you can provide a business case for convincing that what you're trying to say advocate for China is in their interest and not just an extension of our own values, the more that can be effective. For example, on human rights issues, if you can make the argument, for example, on the coronavirus, if you want to talk about transparency and governance, you can make a business case for China right now behind closed doors saying, look, you lost a month of potential activity that could have possibly contained this virus because of your system, because of the way you manage, you control the lack of transparency and your crackdown on the very people who are trying to draw attention to this. This should tell you something. Human rights, basically you can argue that human rights, respect for human rights, respect for more democracy, in the other hand, is ultimately more stable and ultimately provides more possibility for addressing challenges and long-term challenges in any country. You can also, for example, on the Uyghur issue, which is abominable the way they're treating them, we can bring Canada's experience to us and say, look, we have our own experience in how we have treated our Indigenous people, and it has been very costly in social terms, in financial terms, because of this incredible mismanagement of this. And so, I think the more you can present issues in that way, the more you're going to find some kind of listening. some kind of a willing listener.
Excellent, thank you. One more last question. And this is for you, Mr. Evans. So how much room do we have for pursuing an independent China policy that might cut across the American policy of treating China as a strategic competitor, adversary, or enemy, for example, with Huawei?
In 15 seconds.
Well, I think the Huawei question is exactly the right one to ask, because it is where these forces come together. And the challenges of a made-in-Canada decision are really an important issue as a signal of where we're going to go. I think that the consensus in the United States is somewhat cracking on the Huawei issue, even if it isn't represented at this moment in their elected officials. Business, think tanks,
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. I'm sorry.
See the dangers of decoupling and are backing off from that hardline full confrontation.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we have very little time for each of our members to ask their questions. Monsieur Bergeron, 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Très rapidement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, I understand that Canadian policy on China is paralyzed. I noted what Mr. Burton said with regard to the fact that, as with the United States, we have to change the way we deal with China. Perhaps you can tell us what role the provinces can play in that regard. And another question for all three witnesses, which we couldn't ask to our officials. Is Canada, does it have the tools it needs now in terms of analysts? And to come back to what Mr. Calvert said earlier, to a question by Ms. Leslev, is Canada well equipped to deal with this new paradigm involving China?
Qui vous pose la question, Mr.
So who exactly? Mr. Burton? Mr. Bergeron, my first question was for Mr. Burton.
I think certainly we've had some very effective representatives from provinces in China. I know some from the province of Quebec when I was serving in the embassy who were particularly strong, not only in trade, but in general in the discussions that occur between diplomats in that posting. Do we have the analysts that we need to defend our interests in China adequately? I would say we do not. It's very difficult to get people with the requisite expertise in understanding the communist system, fluency in the Chinese language, and I think the willingness to spend a lot of time engaging with their Chinese colleagues. This is not simply a problem for Canada, but it is a big problem for Canada. The thing is, there is no short-term solution. Many countries at present are providing scholarship incentive programs to graduate students to acquire this expertise. It's we really do have to get serious about it, but it's not something that we can solve in a short term.
Professor Evans.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the question of province and competence, Asian competence, is very interesting because it takes us back to our universities. And I think that one of the areas that the committee could be of great value in is looking at the role of the universities and the challenges they now face in dealing with China. Some of those are opportunities in terms of recruitment of students, but there are whole new challenges about protecting.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt again, but the 2.5 minutes is up. Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. A lot of Canadians, as we all know, are very motivated by concern for human rights in China, whether it be the Uyghurs or whether it be the case of the imprisonment of Michael Spavor and Michael Sporvik. And throughout history of our relationship, we've always demanded that the Prime Minister raise the question of human rights in meetings with the leadership of China. These things have been going on for 50 years. And my question is the international human rights mechanisms that are available, are they capable of playing a role in solving this issue, or do we need other things? We have public statements, we have normal diplomatic channels, etc., but are there any other things that we could or should be doing that could help us? And I would like just briefly, if each of you could address that with, is there anything else that we're missing here?
Certainly, Mr. Harris, the UN institutions are not very effective. I note that North Korea has ratified both of the main human rights covenants, and clearly we're not able to get them to be in compliance. So from that point of view, I think that some of these institutions to some extent have been co-opted by the power of China in the UN to prevent nations from supporting exposure of Chinese human rights abuses. But as I said in my opening statement, we do have the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, the Magnitsky List, and I think it's a glaring shortcoming that the country that has the most human rights abuse on the planet is excluded from our Canadian list.
Thank you. Dr. Evans?
I think this is a very interesting problem that you've identified. And what we are going to do with China on human rights, I would say that public attitudes are quite interesting. When we ask Canadians, what do you think our government's major priorities should be with respect to China, human rights consistently comes out fourth on a list. After trade, after cooperation on global issues, and after protection of Canadian values and institutions at home. So I think that how far we put this in as our priority is important.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Time for Professor Calvert to say anything.
15-second answer, Mr. Calvert. Sorry.
If we're wanting to change China as a whole, that's going to be very difficult. We have to find specific, small, concrete issues and work to as I said, to convey to China why it's in their interest to do this. Find areas where we can work together collectively, and build out on what we can do from there. We used to have a human rights dialogue.
Thank you. Sorry. We're at 25 seconds or so. Sorry about that, but I thank the witnesses very much. We do deeply appreciate your time here and your understanding with the fact that each member has only so much time, so we have to roll through these quite quickly. And I invite all the witnesses to send additional information in writing to the clerk if you wish to do so. Thank you again. We'll suspend for 5 minutes to...
if I could,
Mr. Katsikatis?
Can I read into the record a motion?
You want to move a motion?
Move a motion, excuse me. That the clerk of the committee make the necessary arrangements for a working lunch on Thursday, February 27th, 2020.
Is it agreed? Or we can come... Sorry. We want to come back for that? We'll come back to that after the break, perhaps. So we'll suspend for 5 minutes to allow the witnesses to leave and to get the new witnesses and teleconferences in place. Thank you again. Committee back to order. Order. We have our second session now, and with us, we have, and forgive me if any mispronunciations, I can't even say that word. We have Jeremy Paltiel, Professor at the Department of Political Science at Carleton University, Yves Desvergins, Professor, Department of Political Science and Faculty Associate, School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia, by video conference from Vancouver, British Columbia. And we have from the Canada West Foundation, Carol Dade, Director, Trade and Investment Center, along with Sharon Shanyang Sun, Trade Policy Economist, Trade and Investment Center, or Carlo Dade, I'm sorry. I think I mispronounced that, excuse me. Did I say Carol?
I get that once a month.
My mother's name, I have that in mind. I see those letters arranged. Anyway, thank you very much. We'll begin with Mr. Paltiel.
Thank you very much. Members of the Common Special Committee on Canada-China Relations, I thank you for the honor of testifying before you today. Je suis très reconnaissant d'avoir cette occasion de témoigner devant vous.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to appear before you, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions you might have in English or in French.
Marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of bilateral relations between the People's Republic of China and Canada. It also marks the 50th anniversary of my starting to learn Chinese. So I see this as a particularly opportune moment from which to examine our bilateral relationship. My presentation is in 3 parts. In the first part, I review the pattern of our relationship. In the second, I offer my perspective on the nature of the Chinese regime and the constraints this imposes on our bilateral relations and our alliance relations. And in the third, I offer some perspective on the current state of our relations and how we may move forward. We negotiated the establishment of bilateral relations beginning in 1968. A time when the People's Republic of China was largely isolated diplomatically during the unprecedented turmoil known as the Cultural Revolution. The premise of our initiative was not to endorse the Chinese regime, nor was it that China would transform itself into Canada. The human rights situation was then much worse than it is today. Underlying our establishment of diplomatic relations, and I defer to Professor Paul Evans on this question since he literally wrote the book, was to bring China into the community of nations for the sake of global peace and security, as well as to diversify our foreign relations and trade, and to show ourselves to be an independent global actor. Our effort was eventually rewarded beyond our initial hopes. The People's Republic of China took its seat as a permanent member of the UN Security Council within months of the establishment of diplomatic relations in October 1970, and within 10 years, China began the process of reform and opening up, which led to China's spectacular rise. Canada played a role as a partner in China's reform and opening through our CEDA program, which began in 1981. China's reform and opening turned into a hope that China's reform would lead it into a full participant in the liberal international order. This initial hope was contradicted by the events of Tiananmen in 1989. When China's economic reforms resumed in 1991-92, our CEDA programs also continued, and hope was reignited, albeit on a more cautious and a more long-term trajectory. China's efforts to join the World Trade Organization were symbolic of this renewed effort, and it was in this context in 1998 that then Chinese Premier Zhu Rongji called Canada China's best friend in the world. Canadian efforts facilitated the adaptations of China's legal system and its institutions to the demands of an open trading system when China entered the WTO in January 2001. In the 21st century, China no longer needs Canada to tutor it, nor to open doors for it. Just as China's success grew apparent, our relationship lost its overall strategic rationale. The spectacular growth of the Chinese economy became the new justification for our relationship, but we were disappointed that our previous history granted us no special privilege in the Chinese market. Even the Team Canada approach failed to arrest the decline in our market share of the Chinese economy, and our trade fell into persistent deficits that see us buying basically $2 for every dollar, buying $2 for every dollar we sell. We have not been able to establish a strategic focus in our relations under both liberal and conservative governments. Over the past decade and a half, as Canada's power has grown, China's power has grown rather, our disappointed hopes have become increasingly tinged with fear. Since the nature of the Chinese regime, since Xi Jinping, who rose to power at the 18th Party Congress in 2012, China has moved from a defense of China's difference as an exception to the universality of liberal values to celebration of its governance based on its own cultural traditions and achievements of the communist regime. Xi has been careful not to broadcast that the Chinese model should be copied or imposed, but nonetheless offers his country's experience as a model for developing countries to learn from. However, it is worth remembering that at the time when Canada recognized China in October 1970, Chairman Mao and the Chinese Communist Party still espoused global revolution and the overthrow of capitalism. That is not the case today. Beijing's concerns about liberal democracy largely stem from its fears about the domestic security of its own regime. It does not seek to aggressively undermine regimes abroad. It's not Russia. As the world's greatest exporter, China is inherently committed to an open, rules-based international trading order. China is trying to cement its status through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. These efforts to increase prosperity and connectivity through the BRI and the AIIB are not themselves a threat to Canada. Investment in public goods like infrastructure will pay dividends even if we are not direct beneficiaries or participants. Moreover, closer engagement will allow us to exercise some influence, such as our membership in the AIIB, over the direction and management of these programs. We do confront China as a successful competitor that has adapted market methods to achieve state-led goals. This is a challenge, but it is not a threat to the rules-based order in itself. China's Leninist regime is designed to insulate the political leadership from outside influence, domestic or international. So its entire outlook is based on this insulating itself from the outside, internally and externally. Yet the continued survival of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China has now survived longer than the Soviet Union did, requires it to adapt and learn. China is sensitive, in the best and worst sense of this term, to outside opinion and to criticism from below. The Chinese dream of China's great rejuvenation represents joining the world, not isolating China from it. One concrete expression of this is the hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in Canada. Our strategy must allow for different representations of the will of the Chinese people while recognizing that the Chinese government we are dealing with is the government that is empowered to make commitments by the Chinese state. We have no control or say on how it may change or when. Canadian prosperity and global influence depend on having a workable relationship with China. Right now, we have the worst relationship of any of the G7 countries with China. But there are signs that our relationship is thawing. This provides hope for improvement, but I share with other Canadians the conviction that there can be no fundamental improvement in the relationship until the two Michaels go free. The Chinese have an expression that they employ often in their diplomacy called 求同存异, which means emphasize points of agreement while reserving differences. We must craft a strategy that allows us to do that even though we have serious ongoing human rights concerns, particularly as regards Xinjiang. We cannot disentangle China from the fate of the globe, and any hope of isolating or containing China is doomed to fail. There is a whole agenda of issues, including climate change and global health, where we have no choice but to work with China. Our prosperity, like China, depends on an open, rules-based trading system. We cannot safeguard that system and a healthy environment for global innovation without China.
Got 35 seconds. Can you wrap up, please, if you don't mind?
So I have a few more comments, but basically the premise of our engagement is not to remake China in our own image, but to cooperate in areas of common interest and to reserve a space where critical concerns will be listened to on the basis of reciprocity. And we've obviously moved to one where we have to emphasize reciprocity more and more. Apart from the fact that China no longer needs us to open doors, we have too many pressing concerns for which to ignore. And I will submit my other comments, and I'll let the other commentators go forward.
10 minutes bang on. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Monsieur Tiberghien.
Merci, Monsieur le Président et membres du
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. It's an honor for me to be here to take part in your study. I will share some results of my research on the relationship between Canada and China. You are doing important work, and I know it is urgent to take a closer look at this relationship, given the fact that Canadians are imprisoned in China, most specifically the two Michaels. We are all concerned by the relationship between Canada and China, especially since the arrest of Meng Wanzhou.
Of a public health crisis where we have a lot of diplomats in China, including the ambassador, and where the biggest lockdown of cities have taken place in the modern age with terrible suffering. I also take this chance to thank the clerk of the committee and the staff making a difference every day, including pages, handset, translators, and clerks. I have a student now who served as page last year, and it was a fantastic training ground. So I'd like to start with 2 key points, and then I'll focus on some key aspect of the international system as it relates to Canada, China, and some points on China and some implications for Canada. First, the Canada-China downturn is part of a larger period of great disruption in global politics. Every country today is adjusting its posture in international affairs and responding to the moves of others. Second, in this context, Canada's priorities are to be robust defense of the national interest and finding actionable pathways to defend the rules-based international order with key partners. Effective multilateralism must underpin Canada's action in the international arena. So now some points on the international context and how it impacts the Canada-China relation. I call this the age of disruptions. To a large extent, the Canada-China crisis is part of the larger US-China crisis, and is a prism for the challenges to the rules-based order. Let me elaborate on 5 key drivers and their impact. First, we're living through a crisis of globalization. We see peaking trade flows, a move toward the regionalization and deglobalization of global supply chains. Globally induced inequalities have led to great polarization and tensions in most advanced democracies. This is an age of anxiety and anger in countries like the US, the UK, France, Italy, Greece, Poland, and many others. Second, we're facing systemic shifts in our economic system due to the combination of climate change and the fourth industrial revolution. These two forces are creating heightened competition. Third, we have just lived through one of the greatest shifts in economic power in modern history. Between 2000 and 2018, over 20% of global GDP in nominal dollars shifted hands from OECD countries to emerging economies. Of this shift, 60%, that is 12 points, went to China. The rest went to India, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa. The IMF estimates today that Asia represents 60% of world growth today and for the next decade. The open economy facilitated that shift, yet it's also important to note that China and India are essentially returning to where they were for 2,000 years until 1820, that is before the Industrial Revolution and colonization. As part of this change, we see a more assertive China, but also a more assertive India, Russia, Indonesia, Africa. Fourth, China today represents 16% of world GDP in nominal dollars and 19% in PPP terms. That's 2018 data. From 2012 to 2020, China has represented 1/3 of global growth. China is a giant in every domain, from health to renewable energy to AI, big data, international students, UN peacekeeping soldiers. We cannot work on any global issue in the world today without working with China. We also observe a recoupling of Asia's sub-regions, such as South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and China. Those regions had been disconnected since colonial times, over 200 years, and in fact since the fall of Tamerlane, the last Mongol ruler in 1405. Fifth, we're currently witnessing a shock on the international order as the US, the leader that created the liberal order, is under the Trump administration turning against many of the multilateral institutions that the US created and nurtured since World War II. We don't know yet if it's a bargaining readjustment or a longer-term disruption to the 100-year search for order going back to Woodrow Wilson following World War I. The consequences of those 5 disruptions and systemic changes is a period of growing geopolitical rivalry. I see tremendous dynamism. I also see tremendous misperceptions, since every power is reading the action of the others through its own historical frame and narratives. For example, the arrest of Madame Meng Wanzhou in December 2018 led to extremely powerful reactions among the Chinese public and among the government, revealing great misunderstandings about Canada's true intentions. Of course, the same is true on the Canadian side. You may unlock such misunderstandings by looking for clues in Europe. I'm also struck that the internet has not narrowed perceptions among groups or nations, but increased them due to echo chamber effects and overload. In this context, it's essential to start by understanding what drives and motivates other players so as to find actual pathways to get things done. It's crucial to avoid emotional tit-for-tat cycles that led to everybody being worse off. Case in point, see the EU's wake-up call with the last op-ed written by Josep Borrell, the current High Representative of the EU, on February 8, 2020, in Project Syndicate. He urged Europe to wake up to a world where big players don't play according to rules, but practice issue linkage and power politics. He urged the EU to have strategic thinking, build leverage, and coalitions. We hear similar views from our key allies in Asia, Japan. So now I say a few things about China and Chinese governance and Chinese perceptions. China is complex and paradoxical, has gained great international power, and yet faces more domestic and global uncertainties today than at any time since the end of the Mao era. Here are a few challenges. First, about Chinese governance. If you talk to members of the Chinese middle class in recent years, you get a sense of great hope and emergence from great trauma. China was a wealthy and peaceful country in 1820, representing 30% of the world economy. After 1820, China lived through 2 opium wars and a loss of trade and foreign autonomy to Western powers and Japan. There were great peasant rebellions that killed upward of 50 million people in the late 1800s. The great hope of the 1911 revolution with Sun Yat-sen was followed immediately by fragmentation into warlord regions, civil war for decades, invasion by Japan that killed another 20 million, more civil war, Korean War. China did have a few good years in 52 to 57, followed by the madness of the anti-rightist campaign, the Great Leap Forward, with a famine that killed 50 million more, followed in turn by Mao's Cultural Revolution. No wonder why the middle class supports stability and sees the current decades as the best time in China in 150 years, an age of prosperity and possibility. There is, of course, broad support for the regime. Many Chinese feel a sense of great progress, growing wealth and prosperity, greater freedom, except the political freedom, particularly the ability to criticize the party. There is also, of course, increasing desire for information and voice, especially on social media. At the same time, given that the middle class is only 25% of the population, it's not yet in its interest to hand power to the 75% rest of the population. Think of Thailand and the Yellow Vest pushback against democratically elected Thaksin. What I hear, however, are aspirations for evolution over time that would yield better political freedom and governance without the trauma of national fragmentation of past dynastic change. Second, given long and sophisticated political history over thousands of years, and China representing a big share of humanity's collective experience, Chinese people and government alike expect recognition for that heritage. The current government may be Leninist in structure, but it often behaves like a government that inherited practices and norms from past dynasties. Third, while China does not buy in a political pillar of the liberal order, governance is nonetheless fragmented and pluralistic. Despite Xi Jinping's very strong accumulation of power and crackdown on many fields like media, the structure of power remains collective leadership. When Xi doesn't get the support of the 25-strong Politburo, the 7-strong Standing Committee, he cannot move forward. In fact, to stay on for a third mandate after 2022.
Excusez-moi, Monsieur Président, vous avez 30 secondes.
I'm sorry, you only have 45 seconds left. If you can summarize.
As zones of darkness and zones of lights and progress. The more insecure China is, the more it tightens control. We need to find an effective way to deal with this. Implications for Canada. We cannot wish China to go away. We have to deal with the China we have. We need a differentiated approach with China. With certain practices, national interests, we have to protect our security. But the longer term of Canada is to buttress the rules-based international order and to make sure China gets integrated into it. We must focus on outcomes.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. We now have the Canada West Foundation. I understand that Mr. Dade and Ms. Sun will be sharing the 10 minutes.
Oui, c'est ça. D'accord. Avant de commencer, comme toujours.
Before beginning, as always, I would like to begin by thanking the committee and the chair as well as the clerks for your assistance.
Be here. It's 2 times in 2 weeks for the Canada West Foundation to be in Ottawa testifying before Parliament on issues of great importance, obviously to Canada, but also to the West. And this is where our testimony will focus today. If we had 30 minutes to go it alone, we would stay with the high-level discussions, but we'd like to bring the testimony down to some concrete elements about our engagement. I trust, too, Monsieur le Président, that since we're the only institutional speaker today, we can get an extra 15 or 20 seconds to describe our institution. So once again, the West is shut out.
Everyone gets equal time.
But all kidding aside, the Canada West Foundation, and this presentation comes from the Canada West Foundation, we were created 50 years ago, moments much like today, to assure that the West has a voice in affairs that shape the country, but more, to assure that the West can contribute to creating a strong and prosperous Canada. A strong West is a strong Canada, and nowhere is that more evident than in our relations with Asia. So, we've been through some difficult times, the West and the country. We are in some now, but we continue to work towards that vision of a strong West and a strong Canada. And given what's happened today, we just hope that the rest of the country will continue to respond and to reach out to us. On Asia and engagement, we have 3 points today for the committee about this. So Asia and Canada's engagement has been a focus for the Canada West Foundation. We carried out modeling, economic impact assessments, which another committee, members in another committee asked that the government do so that Parliament could actually have data, intelligence, information to understand trade agreements. We did that for the CTPP, or TPP, in advance of the government doing it. That information was critical for the committee to understand. It was critical for the country to have the data to understand and to keep the country and the government from making the calamitous mistake of walking away from the TPP agreement. Given how our relations with the U.S. and our relations with China have gone, it's easy to see not just how prescient, but how important that sort of information was. We have 3 points for the committee, and we hope that this will guide your thinking going forward and guide your questioning of other witnesses. The first is that Canada's relationship with China flows through the West. The West is the center and the focus of our engagement with China. Yes, other parts of the country are involved, but it is the West where the rubber meets the road. It is the West that is implicated immediately and in ways that other parts of the country aren't. Two, agriculture is a key part of this relationship. And the data that you have before you, which my colleague will walk you through, shows this. Third, agriculture may offer an idea of what a solution or how we begin to build on re-engagement, le renouvellement de la relation quand le temps se prête. It is how we can potentially re-engage when the time is right. I will now turn it over to my colleague, our trade policy economist, to walk us through some of the data.
Merci, Carlo. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The U.S. is and will continue to be our largest trading partner. The average growth of two-way trade with China over the last 10 years has been 12%. That's compared to 4% with the U.S. And 65% of this two-way trade with China comes from the 4 Western provinces. So China has become an important trading partner for Canada and for Western Canada. Et notre engagement avec nos deuxième plus grand
and engagement with our second biggest trade partner will continue to increase.
It's particularly true for agriculture. So if you look at the diagram 6 in the testimony I've shared with you, over $10 billion, or 37% of Canada's total export to China, is actually agriculture. And 75% of this agricultural export to China comes from the 4 Western provinces of Canada. Pour cette raison, une mauvaise
For this reason, even a modest downward trend affects Canada's exports, especially in Western Canada.
Recent issues with China on canola, on pork, on beef, on soy. Therefore, Canada needs market access certainty with China, which means reducing or mitigating arbitrary actions that have harmed farmers and diminished Canadian exports, which means addressing non-tariff barriers in the long term for Canadian agriculture. So while trade and agriculture is important for Canada, it's important for Western Canada, agriculture or food security specifically is very important for China. And we've seen clear indications of this in their 5-year plans. We've seen evidence of this in Made in China 2025, their industrial policy that aims for self-sustainability in agriculture as one area by focusing on smart agricultural technology. We see evidence of this in the Belt and Road Initiative that focuses on transportation and infrastructure connectivity by land and by sea as an indication for longer-term agricultural supply certainty. OECD also has projections on agricultural consumption by 2028, and China comes first for many of the agricultural sectors that are important for Canadian export, such as pork, oilseed, protein meal, soybean, and cereal. Alors, l'intérêt de la Chine est la sécurité agroalimentaire.
So China's interest is food security, and it is in Canada's interest to have market access certainty. Therefore, agriculture is a shared interest for both countries, but the interest is based on different reasons.
Agriculture, on the one hand, China needs food security, access to certainty on access to supply. Even though China is moving to become self-sufficient in certain commodities, the overall demand means that they will always need foreign inputs, if not simply the backstop, but to feed the population. On the other hand, Canada needs market access certainty. If we are going to have producers risk farms, risk investments, risk things that have been in their families for generations, we need certainty about access to markets. That certainty has just been redefined by the U.S.-Canada Phase 1 trade agreement. At Canada West, we're engaged on a project to examine how other countries are dealing with non-tariff barrier issues with China. We've looked at Australia, New Zealand, obviously, but Brazil. I would suggest that the committee, you always hear Australia, Brazil, New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S., but Brazil has some interesting insights. But what the U.S. has done, looking at the Phase 1 agreement, is to redefine what market access certainty is. There are 121, give or take, specific concessions that the U.S. got from China in that agreement. 51 of those are what I would call hyper-specific commitments and concessions. They're things like, within 20 days of receipt of any monthly updates to the list of U.S. pet food and non-ruminant-derived animal feed facilities that the U.S. has determined to be eligible to export, China shall register the facilities, publish the updates to the list on the Chinese GACC, the Chinese Customs website, and allow imports of food derived from animal feed from U.S. facilities on that list. You have the same thing for pork. You have the same thing for beef. These types of market access certainty is the bar. This will essentially have us out of the Chinese market. So if you think about access and what we need to get from China, agriculture offers a possible solution. If we were to engage China, guarantee access to Canadian supply, not that we'll send a certain amount, but that we will not impose political restrictions on China's access to food, on China's access to agricultural technology, on China's ability to invest or access agricultural biotechnology, on China's ability to invest agricultural production, and China's ability to invest in agricultural processing, we have the makings potentially of an agreement. This distinguishes us from the Americans who do use food as a political weapon throughout their history, and even just 2 months ago, a former U.S. Undersecretary was threatening to cut off food to North Korea. We distinguish ourselves from the Americans. We establish why we are different, and we have the basis for re-engaging China to reset the relation. Obviously, China will want more, but this is a start. So for the committee,
I'm sure you'll be chances to speak some more during the answers to questions. Before I go, thank you very much. Before I go to questions, we had Mr. Fadjiskatos' motion earlier that I probably should have come to after the break. Is it agreed? Yes. Agreed. Thank you very much. Now we have the 6-minute round. Mr. Jenis.
Thank you. Mr. Tiberghien, I wanted to ask my questions to you. You've said some things about the Canada-China relationship that are different from things I've read in other sources, so I thought I would dig in a little bit. But I wanted to start, your colleague, Mr. Evans, suggested that we talk a bit about the relationship between Canadian universities and the relationship between that and the Canada-China relationship. I wanted to ask you, when it comes to the Canada-China relationship and the Canada-Huawei relationship, do you have a sense of the UBC's financial exposure, how much your institution would stand to lose financially in terms of partnerships if certain things happened that made those partnerships less possible?
Thank you, Mr. Jenis. So I don't have a sense. I don't manage the overall budget of UBC. What I do know is when I was director of the Institute of Asian Research, we had no funding from Chinese sources. I mean, we had older endowments that came from Japan, from Taiwan, etc., but we had no. So the main exposure of UBC is primarily through students, right? Student flows. But students are not just agents of of the Chinese states. They're independent, members of the middle class by and large, and they're very hard to control, right?
I appreciate that, and I agree about the important role there. But I've read, and I don't know if you can confirm these figures or not, that at the beginning of the 2019, UBC and Huawei alone had partnerships worth $7.6 million over 3 years. That the exposure on the Vancouver Summer Program, which was for summer students coming for a month-long period, was about $10 million. So, maybe you don't have those numbers offhand. I researched them beforehand, and it's interesting the level of exposure that UBC has. In the context of that partnership with Huawei, has CSIS ever issued warnings to you or the university that you know of about the risks of collaboration with Huawei?
Not to me, no.
Okay, thank you. But are you aware of those CSIS issuing warnings to other officials at the university?
Mainly for my colleague Paul Evans, right? So he has more contact with CSIS.
Okay, all right. You mentioned not managing the university's overall budget. Are you still the executive director of UBC's China Council?
Yes.
You are. Okay. It's interesting that didn't come up in the introduction. My understanding of UBC's China Council is that it's a body of administrators and faculty who advise the university on, among other things, how the UBC can advance and protect its financial interests vis-a-vis China. Do you think it's a problem for you to be responsible for working with the university on advising them on their financial interests vis-a-vis China, while also offering expertise to the public on Canada-China relations?
I need to correct one thing. The China Council has no responsibility for financial issues, right? This is purely managed by the respective vice presidents and the president. The China Council is mostly an advisory group that meets not very often. Recently it's like about twice a year to review certain broad questions and to have conversation. And then this advice is handed over to the Vice Provost International and the team, right? So at the moment, the role of China Council is actually quite limited.
Okay, let me ask some specific questions about the role. Do professors on the China Council at UBC ever consult with administrators on the council before speaking publicly, and do they ever ask for speaking points before offering public comment?
No, and the main reason is because the prime role of a professor, in a university is academic freedom.
Yes.
But when I speak to the media, I don't speak as China Council, and I never mention that title. I speak as a professor of political science with academic freedom.
Okay.
So those roles are separate, and I keep them very carefully separate.
Okay. Are professors on the China Council ever involved in commercial negotiations with Huawei?
No.
Thank you. Does the China Council play a direct role in university fundraising or in providing advice related to fundraising?
Not in many years. There were some early discussions, it goes back 5 years, but in the last 3 to 5 years, there's been no such discussion.
Okay. Are discussions at the China Council held about the implications of Canada's China policy on international student recruitment and university revenue?
We have had some discussions about trying to have visibility about what could happen with students. By the way, I also need to correct, in terms of exposure, the Vancouver summer program and Huawei contracts are very different things, right?
Oh,
Vancouver
yes, of course.
summer program, it's under a student, right?
So, yeah, no, I understand. I didn't mean to conflate those at all, so apologies if I did. What I meant to just identify those as two very significant examples of multi-million-dollar exposure of the university. So you said
the bigger exposure is the flow of students, right?
Yes,
the
exactly.
Summer program is a small part. There is a bigger number.
And just because of time, my final question: would decisions about the awarding of honorary degrees ever be discussed at the council?
No, because the honorary degree decisions are something made by the Senate, and so they always, the Senate has all prerogatives and is very, very strict about this.
Okay, I think that's my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jenis. Mr. Frederiskatos, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, let me just extend a message of respect to all witnesses, particularly Professor Tiberghien, who had to withstand that line of questioning and did so very calmly. We're very fortunate as a committee to benefit from the insights of witnesses, and today is no different. Let me begin, if I could, with Mr. Dade. Mr. Dade, in the previous testimony, I'm not sure if you were here, but if you were, you would have heard Charles Burton from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who made a statement that I thought was quite interesting and surprised me. I'd just like to get your insights and that of Ms. Sun, as well. He said that, and I'm paraphrasing, global commodities, if Canada wanted to shift its export focus away from China, global commodities could be sold elsewhere. And he implied that that could be done relatively easy. What you've presented us here in terms of cold, hard data is just how entrenched the relationship is in terms of our economies vis-a-vis China, and particularly on agriculture, and the Western provinces figure quite prominently in that. Would it be very easy to just shift quickly, as Mr. Burton implied?
Thank you for the question. I'll pass along your appreciation to witnesses to the others who preceded us, including the ambassador. You would have to pull in the private sector, the trading houses, and those who are directly involved to get the definitive answer. I would submit to you that looking at the data and an understanding of commodity flows, long-term contracts, planting decisions, the investments, the massive investments that go to production, the massive investments that go for trade infrastructure, I would submit to you that the answer would probably be no, but I suggest you call in the experts to get a first-hand confirmation of that.
Sure.
And just to add as well, as you can see in the report, we excluded U.S. in all of our data sets because our trade with U.S. is still so large, even though we have a mandate for trade diversification. And this is because shifting supply chain is very costly and takes a lot of time. And so countries will always be trading with other countries that are larger in economic size and closer to us in geographic distance. So yes, trade agreements, institutions that are in place do make a difference, but ultimately it's businesses that trade. And so that is what determines the flow.
I was also interested, Mr. Dade, when you began your presentation by saying that Canada's relations with China flow through the West. It is, I think it's fair to say, a very underappreciated element of the relationship, just how prominently the Western provinces figure in that bilateral. Could you expand on that? And I see Mr. Paltiel nodding his head as well, if you wanted to comment.
Sure. So I think the data speaks for itself. In addition to the trade relations, you'll note that the Western provinces all have on-the-ground representation in China and throughout Asia. I was just in Beijing, and I spent days with the Alberta office and the various staff that the Alberta office has on the ground. So indeed, other provinces, La Belle Province, bien sûr, but certainly the Western provinces are on the ground, and they have deep relations and staff, and that's a benefit to the entire country. Working together with the provincial officials, we have greater reach at lower levels of government, and it's an assistance for us. It's an indication, though, as you mentioned, of the importance.
I only have 2 minutes, so if I could put it to Professor Paltiel and then to Professor Tiberghien. We heard from Professor Paul Evans in the previous meeting that we had this morning. He recommended a few ways forward for Canada on this relationship that we have with China. One of the suggestions that he made was pursuing a strategy of coexistence, as he put it. To quote from him, this would involve finding ways to live with China, cooperating where we can on common issues. The former ambassador, Paul Calvert, also said that we ought to find specific issues where we can work collectively. Is there low-hanging fruit that we can identify, or that you can, both of you esteemed colleagues can suggest, where Canada can reach out and identify so that we can move forward in a meaningful way and perhaps enhance this thaw that we're seeing in Canada-China relations right now?
30 seconds each, please. Well, Professor Evans mentioned peacekeeping. I think that's an obvious one. My colleagues to the left here mentioned agriculture is one that's been identified for a long time. There's an interest, vital interest in both countries. Healthcare and the whole area of healthcare and long-term care, things having to do with aging in China. These are non-controversial things that we can work together on.
Mr. Tiberghien, if you wanted to add.
Sure, I'll add a couple things. First, we have Bruce Aylward, Canadian, for the WHO on the ground in China right now doing press conference. So public health is a huge one right now. Climate change, green tech is enormous. City management, urban planning, there's enormous progress in China. And then G20, the work around on G20, WTO. China is part of the 17 countries that have signed with Canada on the potential short-term fix, or at least the mediation mechanism to replace the dispute settlement mechanism at the moment.
Monsieur Bergeron, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that all the warnings, analyses, observations, commentary lead us to believe that the Communist Party has taken control of the state apparatus in a very firm way. There's a very close relationship between the party itself and the state apparatus. It's been said that there's been a change in paradigm with the current General Secretary, Xi Jinping. Do you believe that there is indeed a connection between Mr. Xi Jinping's personality and the control he wields over China and the change in paradigm we are witnessing today, a change which has had a huge impact on Canada? As you said, do you believe that at a certain point, do you believe that there will be a new general secretary at any point soon? Thank you for the question.
It has played a role. I would say that it's a combination of factors. That is to say that China has risen. It's become more powerful. The difficulties that the West saw in the 2008 crisis and the difficulties of the United States, ongoing problems with wars in the Middle East, has given an opportunity for China, and Xi Jinping has seized on this. On the other hand, the other reason is that many Chinese themselves were aware of the fact that this hypothesis of that China will eventually converge with the West is not something that is only heard in the West. Many Chinese communist officials, and I believe Xi Jinping himself, are worried that as China becomes more integrated into the global rules-based system, Chinese themselves will begin to question whether there's any role or rationale for the Chinese Communist Party. And we've seen since Xi Jinping came to power a real effort to try and re-emphasize the ideology, the role, and practices of the Chinese Communist Party. On the other, and to the other last part of your question, I recently wrote a part of a debate on the coronavirus and its effect on Chinese politics. I do believe that, in some sense, Xi Jinping is overstretched. His assertiveness has gone. I can't predict when or how changes will take place in China. That's like predicting earthquakes. We know where the fault lines are, but we don't know when the earthquake's going to happen. But I think that underneath the surface, there are some questions about the handling of governance, and that these will eventually bubble up. And yes, this will be a part of perhaps a change over time. I did go on record thinking I'm not sure that he will serve out a third term. That's my own personal speculation, but it's based on my knowledge of how Chinese communist processes work.
Cette fois encore, Monsieur le Président, on a entendu.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we've seen and heard that our witnesses would have more to say than the time they have available. So again, to these witnesses, if any of you wish to add anything else, please send in any written observations you might have. You can send those in to the clerk. Jacques Parizeau had said of globalization, it's like trying to stop the tide from coming in. It's impossible. You just have to adapt. And I think we are still adapting to the effects of globalization, as the professor said a few moments ago. That said, I was struck by the difference in testimony of the second panel versus the first panel. The first panel seemed to call on Canada to be more firm with China, and the second panel seems to call for more collaboration between Canada and China. So we MPs, members of this committee, how can we take these two pieces of advice, which on the face of it seem contradictory? Are you asking me that question? Well, I would say that the challenge is adapting.
and we also have to adapt to the reality of China itself. So that's to say that the world has changed, and it's not just changed in China. The United States has changed in response to it, and we have to adapt to this world, and our traditional policies aren't worked very well. We can't simply rely on our ally to protect us, because our ally itself has turned its back in some ways on the rules-based international order. We saw, in fact, the January 15th agreement is a managed trade agreement. So the United States will now be playing a role in which they take unilateral gains from their relationship with China based on their market size, not based on the rules-based order. So we have to actually work to protect the rules-based order, and our best partner may not be the United States. This is a new world.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank all of the witnesses for bringing forth their perspectives, particularly the historical dynamics and the change in our relationship over the years. I'd say all three presentations, including Mr. Dades, was dependent upon or suggested that we ought to be improving and buttressing the rules-based international order. In some cases, I believe, but Mr. Dade, and I'll ask you about it specifically, the question for you all, though, is how do we go about doing that? I mean, if we did have a rules-based international order, it might be easier to solve the problems that we have right now with China with respect to human rights or with respect to trade. We've been vulnerable to them taking action against us. Of course, we've been vulnerable to the United States doing the same thing. But in respect of China, how do we actually achieve that goal? Do you have any suggestions for us lay people trying to find solutions to recommend to government?
Donc, nous allons commencer. Question for Mr. Bergeron. If you look at the data indicates that we are tied to China. The data indicates that the private sector, individual consumers across Canada, businesses, producers, farmers, are making a decision that's increasing our trade. When times have been good, trade's been increasing. When times have been bad, trade's been increasing. So the question is, how do we manage that reality? You can have different views as to whether or not that's good, but fundamentally, how do we manage
if I can
that
interrupt,
reality?
Mr. Dade, given that you're concerned about certainty in market access, if the trade-off is investment, which I think you actually encouraged, how do we avoid further vulnerability? And instead of having the percentage of trade being from Western Canada in agriculture being beneficial, all of a sudden the production is all owned by the Chinese, and they're feeding themselves with our land and our resources. How do you avoid that?
We haven't seen that elsewhere. I would take a look again to have you look at the examples of Brazil. But how do we manage this? The rules-based system has been important to Canada in our history. We're facing a time, though, when the U.S. is trying to destroy or undermine the rules-based system. So we have to try and reinforce it with reaching out with like-minded countries. I work with Japan. Joining the TPP was the single biggest statement we could make in trying to keep the rules-based order.
Can you leave time for Professor Pelto?
I'm going to echo that. First of all, we have to change our mindset. We are a Pacific nation, but we think like an Atlantic nation. We have to stop doing that. We have to start thinking like a Pacific nation, which is including the West, and therefore we have to build on those partnerships of the CPTPP to try and build wider networks, especially in Asia, to project the rules-based order. We should look, as Professor Evans and others have said, towards expanding the CPTPP to include China and other actors so that we can extend the rules-based order, because the problem is it is not likely we will have a bilateral free trade agreement anytime soon, or whether it will protect our interests. But we could still work multilaterally through the CPTPP to achieve some of the same ends and to work with the countries involved.
Thank you. Can we hear briefly from Professor Tedrogian?
Yes, thank you, Monsieur Harris. So essentially, my idea would be to differentiate among issues, right? So we cannot take a cookie cutter approach, one size fits all approach with China. There are issue areas where we have to be protective when it comes to spy espionage activities or the like, right? Or cyber issues. There are issues where we can work with China, because China is supporting the rules-based order on the Paris Agreement, on the G20, etc. And then there are issues where we need allies to have any leverage. And the prime allies should start with Europe and Japan, and then the others, of course. And then, of course, in other cases, we can work with the US when the US is on board with some dimensions of the rules-based order. So it's a differentiated approach for a very complex moment.
That's all my time, is it? 1 minute, 40. Whoa.
Americans continue with this managed trade track, we need to have a plan B to follow the Americans.
Yes, and I did want to follow up with you, Mr. Day, because I think it's important, your suggestion that the model that Mr. Trump and the U.S. has been using with China is one that we should attempt to emulate. And I'm just wondering how we could manage to do that, given the strength of the U.S. market and the tactics that were used to achieve that result. It's not a free trade agreement, obviously. It's a clearly managed trade agreement which excludes Canadian production and some of the elements of that. How exactly would Canada achieve a positive result using that sort of approach? What leverage do we have, and what percentage of our trade now? We talked about percentage improvement, but what percentage of our agricultural trade, for example, is with China?
That data is available in what we've handed out. In terms of how we manage this, look, I'm not suggesting we adopt the Trumpian worldview, but on the very specific issue of market certainty on agriculture, the Americans have managed to come up with something new. The idea is we don't have the leverage that the U.S. has, but if we completely flip the script, completely turn it around, the Americans cannot offer the Chinese certainty that America will not use food as a political weapon. We can serve as an example. It's immoral to do so. Canada is a moral country. It's anti-progressive to do so. China will destroy the world if it's going to practice agriculture in ways that aren't at the cutting edge of science and technology.
Part of the knock on China and a deal with China is that they don't necessarily follow the rules.
Thank you very much. Mr. Genis, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fragascatos doesn't appear to have liked my last line of questioning. But Mr. Tiberghien, this is, I think, an important one to follow up on because I have a couple hundred pages of emails exchanged between members of the China Council at UBC over a couple months in early 2019. Those were obtained under a FOIPA request in British Columbia. And these are important things to highlight because I asked you if professors on the China Council at UBC ever consult with administrators before speaking publicly, and if you ever asked for speaking points before offering public comment. You said no. But after receiving an email from a reporter at UBC student newspaper about Huawei and Canada-China relations on January 18, 2019, you wrote to Adrian de Jager, Associate Vice President of Government Relations and Community Engagement, and Muriel Chandrasekaran, Co-Chair of the Canada-China Council, and you asked any advice on how I should respond to this request. Thanks, Eve. Adrian de Jager responded, looping in Kurt Heinrichs, who will share our response to media regarding Huawei. He's the Senior Director of Media Relations for UBC. You replied, thanks, Adrian. For Kurt, I can, of course, provide my expertise on the analysis of the larger Huawei event in Canada-China relations, but I will be asked about impact on UBC reactions, so it is good for me to know well the official response. And do you encourage me to do this interview? ? Thanks, Eve. Now, earlier that month, on January 2nd, you wrote to Paul Evans and others asking for his notes from various meetings. One of the co-chairs of the Canada-China Council.
I didn't raise a point of order in Mr. Genis's last line of questioning, mainly because I thought the witness was doing a very good job responding to all the questions. However, I do believe that in the last round of questioning, Mr. Genis did go well beyond the mandate of this committee into an issue that was not related to the mandate given to us by the House of Commons. We are to look at the relationship of Canada and China. I don't think that the internal workings of one institution are in the particular purview of this committee. I believe it's amounting to both an attack on a person who's a witness who's graciously given us his time, as well as on an institution which has its own priorities. And I just am concerned that we are veering beyond.
Mr. Oliphant, I think this. Look, I do remind members to respect the mandate. However, I don't think this is primarily
Mr. Chair,
debate.
if I could just speak to the point of order before my.
Well, I'd like to have you go on with your questions if you don't mind.
Sure, it's
in terms of
very,
time for all members.
This is a question of the integrity of our research and of the advice we are receiving, and it is very telling that Mr. Oliphant is uncomfortable with these questions. I mean, I'm reading from an internal email in which one of the
another
co-chairs
point of order.
The China Council wrote, "Oh, more points of order."
Point of
He's
order.
Very uncomfortable.
I would like to know what it is telling of, because indirectly,
I'm sorry,
Mr.
this is debate. I'm sorry, you're getting into debate, Mr. Oliphant. I appreciate.
Then it's a point of privilege, not a point of order. So on a point of privilege, not on a point of order, I would argue that the member is impugning my character by saying something is telling of what I am doing when I'm simply trying to raise a point of order. So for me, that's a point of privilege, not a point of order. And if the member has an accusation he is wanting to make, he should make it, but not impugn my character.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. I'm going to go back to Mr. Jenis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, very revealing. The email references an official UBC point of view. I would recommend we have one meeting in which all players are present. Eve, you should trigger that meeting sooner rather than later. And you wrote back saying, I just sent the general email triggering the message. Now, another question I asked you is if professors on the China Council are involved in commercial negotiations with Huawei. You said no. I have here an email you received from Paul Evans on March 9th. It reads as follows. Megan set up a very good meeting for me on Wednesday with 6 of her applied science colleagues. Crisp and informed discussion about experiences when working with China, Huawei-related matters in particular, and the changing environment for future collaborations. Reconciling national security concerns and related risks with advancing research and science is a complicated issue that you're all thinking about. So far, there has been no interaction with Ottawa on this, but clearly an interest in doing so. And then I've suggested a second meeting with the same or a slightly enlarged group or the smaller UBC group. 4 of 5 were with us negotiating with Huawei now. Megan made the case that this is an issue where UBC could play a national leadership role. She'll do some internal consultations, Gail has informed. I had asked you as well if the China Council played a direct role in university fundraising or in providing advice related to fundraising. You said not in many years. On March 20th, 2019, you sent an email to various colleagues called Strategic Follow-Up Action Items, UBC China, in which one of the items is Presidential Advisory Council on China. About this advisory council, you say, Jack Austin, one of the co-chairs of the China Council, remains very excited about this process and thinks that it holds the key to a higher quality relation of UBC with China, but also to fundraising related to China. The minutes from the September 12, 2018 meeting of the China Council say, community engagement and PACC to complete the President's Advisory Council on China to incorporate top societal leaders and future fundraisers, as this could have tremendous impact in terms of the university's reputation, networks, and fundraising. I asked if decisions about awarding honorary degrees were discussed at the council. You said no, but according to the agenda for January 18th, 2019, UBC awarded an honorary degree to Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia. Now, I had asked if CSIS has issued warnings about the risks of collaboration with Huawei. You said not that you were aware of. But on January 22nd of last year, Paul Evans wrote to you and said CSIS has issued warnings already about the risks of research and other collaboration with Huawei in particular. Mr. Chair, I'd like to, in light of this, give notice of the following motion, that the committee undertake a study of no fewer than 4 meetings into the relationship between Canadian universities and Chinese government-controlled entities, and that as part of that study, the committee hear from the co-chairs of the UBC China Council, and that the committee report its findings to the House. This is a notice of motion. I'm not moving the motion, just providing the verbal notice of motion.
Thank you
very
Mr.
much.
Jenis. Je devrais expliquer aux témoins.
I should explain to witnesses that members have the right to use their 5 minutes any way they want. They can make observations, as Mr. Genuis did after asking his first question. I would encourage members, if they ask questions, to leave reasonable time for answers. And so now there's no time for Mr. Genuis to ask a question. So Mr. Dubourg is next on my list. 5 minutes, please. Mr. Bergeron, yes, I understand what you have just... Point of order. I understand what you're saying, but given the nature of what Mr. Genuis has just said, I believe that out of courtesy, we should let the witness respond. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron, but I will leave it up to the other members if they wish to give part of their time to the witness to respond if they so wish. Mr. Dubourg. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I would like to thank all of the witnesses who are appearing today. I would like to thank them for their presentations. Our relationship with China is at an impasse. We're in a difficult situation. Your expertise, gentlemen, is very important to the committee, and it will help us see how we can improve the relationship. Sir, if you would like to respond to Mr. Genuis's long statement, please go ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Dubourg. Yes, of course, I would like to respond. It's important to do so.
No, thank the member for those questions. I want to preface by saying this is really taken out of context. This is picking one little thing out of 100 others. So you pick a lot of noise, but it's, first of all, not representative of the usual function. Out of 200 interviews I may have given in 3 years, this one may be the one where I ask for some thoughts, by the way, and I received none, right? So, and I spoke freely afterwards. And so it's, first of all, put it in a larger context, right? Second of all, I did say that I had not heard directly from CSIS, but I heard from Paul Evans. So I had said that. This is exactly what you found in the emails. Third, when it comes to the PAC, the Presidential Advisory Council, this is an old idea that goes back to 2014, 2015, that has been kicked around in the council and so far has led to nothing. Nothing went out of it. And this is primarily, the idea was to create an advisory group. It's not primarily about fundraising. So you pick a little bit of noise here, but we have to look at the primary goal. I want to also make it clear here that the China Council played a role in, for example, convincing the president not to have a Confucius Institute at UBC. We did the research, we did interviews with government, we found that this was risky, and we pushed back, and we advised against having it. We played a role in ensuring that the Dalai Lama came to UBC. So we are very neutral. We are pretty happy, very proud of this role that we play in hearing all sides. So it's very, very important to state that the elements picked up here were not representative. There was a discussion, as noted in the emails, about Huawei that was triggered by the hearings from Paul Evans in Ottawa. I had hearings at GAC, not at CSIS, where we heard that there's concern in Ottawa. So we did trigger the meeting. The issue was not about managing media, it was about responding to what we heard from government. And we had a very fair discussion. And we decided to monitor and to watch what was happening and to be very careful. Also, one consequence of that was that the officer in charge, the Vice President Research, Gail Murphy, went to Ottawa and was briefed. But she did it not as China Council member, but as Vice President Research. So she's the lead person on managing that. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tiberghien. Now, since we've just mentioned Huawei, I have a question for Mr. Peltiel. I know that in June 2019 there was a meeting to discuss the challenges and solutions. It was a summit or a conference you organized, and the fate of Huawei in Canada, 5G communications network, was discussed.
J'aimerais savoir de vous.
I would like to know from you given the situation with Ms. Meng Wanzhou. The Huawei decision, in your view, should Canada make that decision now, or should we wait? And if we wait, what impact do you think that might have with the Five Eyes, regardless of which way Canada decides to go?
Some complex views. Can't do it in 1 second. The point is that this is an issue of security, yes. And I'm also on record as saying that research partnerships with universities should also be subject to some security concerns. But the problem of Huawei is also a problem of competitiveness and technology development and investment in Canada. So we have to take a look at the Huawei issue, not just, he asked me a question, I need to be able to answer it. From the perspective of what it means if we start banning particular companies in particular countries to the whole notion of national treatment in international trade. Now, that's a problem.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry the time is up. Mr. Jennis, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Professor Tibergien, I do want to give you most of this round to respond to whatever you want to respond to. I do think, in fairness, I asked you questions in the first round, and in the second round, I simply shared emails that seemed to suggest a somewhat different interpretation of the facts. You said in response to my colleague's question just now that in this rare instance, apparently, on January 18th, when you asked Mr. de Jager if he encouraged you to do the interview, you seemed to imply that there was no response. But in fact, there was a response. That email was sent on the Friday. On the Monday, there was a response which says, "Good morning, thanks. Good morning, Eve. Thanks for the note. Please see below for UBC's position on research agreements with Huawei. Hope this helps." And then it contains looks like 5 or 6 paragraphs of bold type, so that's there. That's part of the record, and I would welcome members and members of the public to take a look at these emails, because I think they do raise concerns for me about the fact that we have not one but 2 people today that are coming to us as experts that are involved in this Canada-China Council. So that's a minute and a half, but please, you have 3.5 minutes left of my round to address whatever you like and use how you see fit.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Genius. Thank you for the time. I mean, obviously, I haven't prepared for this, right? I haven't looked back at all of the emails I have. I have 300-400 a day. So thank you for correcting my memory on this. My recollection is that when I met, I often meet the UBC students, student newspaper, because they're often my students, as far as I recollect, whatever this formal facts given by Mr. de Jager may not have popped up in a discussion. I can't recall now. We'll have to check. But as far as I know, most of my interviews with student papers are pretty broad discussions, right? They want to know, what's happening, the views on both sides, et cetera, et cetera. And usually I'm very, very frank. And I've often been very open and frank. So I can look back at whether this was used in interview. It may not have been used even. And to the point that I don't even recall, so it was not very striking, right? So I want to say again that those are, I guess, the emails since January 2019 follow conversations in Ottawa by Paul Evans, for me was with GAC, where we heard for the first time that there was concern in Ottawa. And I guess the professional thing that we did with UBC in the end was to call a conversation, where for the first time there was discussion that involved some deans and the vice president, etc. And it was a professional thing to do to hear what we heard from Ottawa. And that was the bulk of it, right? Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Tibergien. I really feel this is an area where we need to have further study at the committee. And, it would be, we've talked about a few examples of the financial exposure. Clearly, the financial exposure is coming up in conversations of the China Council. we've identified two small examples, which small likely in the scheme of things, which total $17 million for one Canadian university in terms of exposure. I've got about a minute left, but I'll turn that over to Mr. Albus.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Genis and Mr. Chair, and to all our witnesses. I am also concerned. I know Waterloo University has publicly asked for clarification on who it can contract with, particularly when they're concerned about certain corporations. And in this case, I'm sure one of them would be Huawei, although I can't be for certain. But I do think that there's a lot of clarity that is being asked of Canadian universities. I'd like to go to the Canada West Foundation, though. You said that the numbers of growth that Canada has seen over years past in selling our agriculture, for example, to China has gone up and up, and you've suggested that perhaps some sort of deal could be made. I do think that would be subject to the new NAFTA provisions. No, just let me finish here. And I also do think we also need to understand what this U.S.-China managed trade agreement will do to our own exports. I think it's very difficult to foresee that there are not going to be major structural changes in flows in the North American/Chinese trade balance, and those things I think will harm Canadian agriculture. Could you please?
It'll have to be a comment rather than a question, because your time is up, and now we have.
Mr. Chair, may I just suggest that in our remaining time, we'll take maybe 2 minutes and then offer to the opposition, the third and fourth parties.
Very helpful. Thank you very much.
So who will,
is it Ms. Zand? Ms. Zand, please. Ms. Zand.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I want to say thank you again to all of the witnesses, and I want to apologize if anybody has been made to feel uncomfortable. I think sometimes these little moments of gotcha, or these trying to get gotcha, is very unpleasant and is really unprofessional. On that note, though, I would love to ask Mr. Tiberghien about, having spent time in Hong Kong doing research and having given lectures in China on global governance, what do you think of the current state of affairs in Hong Kong and how it's going to evolve? And what's the reaction and attitudes of students in China towards that topic, and also towards global governance?
Merci. Thank you very much for this great question, Madame Zan. So first on global governance, that's an easy one. I'm struck, when I give lectures at universities in China, that there is lots of interest and enthusiasm about the idea of global governance or global public good. So you find a young class, right, at this moment in history where they believe in the rules-based order on the economic and environmental side. There's a lot of interest in UN, in SDGs, in climate change, in a way quite similar to what you see in Europe, or to some extent in places like Japan or Korea, and in Canada. So I want to put this on the table. There is also, when I get to discuss the political situation, usually they do aspire for more freedom and fixing problems in China, but they do it in a way that's humbled by history. So they want to find a pathway that's not going to destroy China like it did in the past, right? So there is that awareness as well. When it comes to Hong Kong, I do feel a bit of sense of tragedy, right? I feel sad because I have a lot of friends in Hong Kong. I was there in 96, 97. I did months of interviews. When I was at Stanford in a legal and cooperation center.
Monsieur le Président, excusez-moi, je suis désolé, mais les 2 minutes sont finies.
I'm sorry, but your 2 minutes are up. So we'll move to Mr. Bergeron. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will try to be brief to give our witnesses time to respond. At the last round of questions, I asked a question which I thought was very relevant because it was the type of question which our officials cannot answer. They cannot answer objectively, not that they don't have the competence. Regardless, I think we're starting to understand that Canada's foreign policy with regard to China has to change. The question I put to previous witnesses is this: do you believe that today Canada is equipped to deal with all the changes that are happening and to adapt to these changes. If I may begin.
For some time the problem is we need more cooperation with people who are facing the same circumstances. We can't deal with China alone. And our traditional way of dealing it is our alliance goes straight to the United States, and the American alliances in Asia are also bilateral alliances. So there is no framework which we could and should use to talking like-minded countries, if you want to call it that way, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, where we can compare notes on not just dealing with China, but also dealing with their allies and the relationship between them. We need a structure for this so that we can actually be on the same page and be able to approach China together collectively, because individually we do not have the leverage. Of course, Europe is also important, but Europe has its own issues and problems.
Besoin d'augmenter la capacité.
With regard to capacity,
think tanks that can engage in an ongoing basis. This is a critical weakness when you look at Australia, when you look at the U.S. Though it's difficult when we stray from the practicalities and we go into political grandstanding and attacking organizations that have worked hard to help Canada and have worked hard to increase our capacity and understanding. We've got to, so capacity. You'll hear this time and time again, we simply don't have the capacity, and what we had here today kind of diminishes our capacity to get capacity.
Thank you. Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, Professor Peltiel, you talked about Huawei, and I'm interested, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I gather from what you're saying, you believe that Canada should take an independent view and decision on with respect to Huawei, and it should include business aspects to it as well as security. Are you suggesting that we should seriously consider an approach that similar to what the UK has taken in terms of recognizing the security issues with respect to certain aspects of the 5G, but that there's business aspects that there can be participation? Is that your position?
That is my position. I've put in my remarks, which I didn't get to, we should take an empirical approach to security issues. We should, and that's what the British have done. That's what Canada has done in the past. We have to be mindful of our senior ally. We also have to be mindful of the risks, but we also have to be mindful of, if we want to have an open climate for investment and also the creation of intellectual property in Canada. Much of the 5G technology that Huawei has developed came from Canadian scientists in Canada, in Ottawa. So we are going to be able to enjoy the benefits of the creation of intellectual property created here in Canada? That's both a question for regulation and for universities, but it's also a question of how we deal with this 5G network issue.
Thank you. And the second question has to do with the question of increased trade with China in a less than absolute market access. Are we making ourselves more vulnerable by become dependent on that trade in the absence of a rules-based system that guarantees they're actually following those rules? The knock on, for example, the idea of a trade agreement with China, and some celebrated the fact that it failed, was that we would be bound by the rules through our legal system, but they would not. Is that a concern? Should we be getting that certainty first?
Look, China is a member of the WTO. It's subject to more anti-dumping provisions than any other country, and it's before the dispute mechanism of the WTO is not working because the United States refuses to name judges to it. So that's a problem that has to be done. We've dealt with. That's not a problem. So China actually acts many ways within the rules of that. We do need the WTO. We do need to move beyond that. Look, your premise of your question is a little strange in some sense. Either we're a trading nation or we're not. When you're a trading nation, you are in that sense automatically vulnerable to changes in trade flows. So unless we decide to go like North Korea to autarky, we have no choice but to be subject to those vulnerabilities.
We have to figure it out.
Well, thank you. That answers
Thank
the
you,
question.
Mr. Harris. Thank you to all the witnesses. We very much appreciate your presence here, whether directly or remotely. C'est beaucoup apprécié. Merci infiniment. The meeting is adjourned.